Welcome into Survivor Analytics. My name is Clyde, and today I will be taking on probably the biggest project I've ever completed on this platform. It's my comprehensive list ranking the top 50 players in the history of Survivor. This isn't a ranking of the most iconic or memorable contestants. These are the most skilled people to ever play the game. The central question directing my list was, if we are running a random season of Survivor, which player do I have the most confidence in winning the show? With that question in mind, my assessment is based more so on characteristics rather than just previous placements. Obviously, placements are important indicators of player quality, but we need to remember that Survivor is a game that inherently includes an element of luck. There are a ton of examples of players who were voted out largely due to factors outside their own control. For this reason, just 29 out of 44 winners earned a spot on this list. So in ranking these contestants, I considered all three components of the game, those being the strategic, social, and physical. With that in mind, I generally favor the social and strategic sides. I think it's more impressive for contestants to socially insulate themselves such that they do not need individual immunity to survive every round. So starting this list at the number 50 spot, we have the final juror of Survivor Palau, Ian Rosenberger. In my opinion, Ian is one of the most underrated contestants in the history of the franchise. Many people remember him solely for his performance in the final immunity challenge of Survivor Palau, where he drops out after 12 hours of standing on a beam in the water. Side note, it's kind of ridiculous to me that dropping out of the longest immunity challenge in Survivor history remains a consensus knock against Ian's resume. Postseason interviews actually revealed that Ian developed peripheral neuropathy in his feet from that challenge, which limited his ability to walk for the next 6 months. This was not a case where Ian simply quit the game. He fought for as long as he possibly could. In my mind, Ian falls into that challenge beast archetype as he is a central contributor to the Karor tribe, which is widely regarded as one of the most successful tribes in Survivor history. On Palau, Karor wins 7 immunity challenges, and they go 11 out of 14 when you include rewards. Later on in the post-merge, Ian wins 2 out of 7 individual immunities up against Tom Wesson, who is widely regarded as one of the best challenge competitors of all time. I think you could throw Ian into any random season of Survivor, and he can typically win 3 or more post-merge immunities. Ian distinguishes himself from other challenge-centric players through his strategic reads on Palau. This factor lands Ian in the top 50 over other contestants who are undoubtedly better than him in that side of the game, like an Ozzy or a Terry Dietz. Strategically, Ian has proven that he can straight up dominate a season as he votes correctly in every tribal council that he attends. Granted, Ian attends just one pre-merge tribal council, so the sample size is relatively smaller, but beyond simply his voting record, Ian demonstrates an ability to coordinate votes that set himself up for the long run. At the final 6, Ian famously convinces Katie to flip, which sets up his side for the end of that season. He shares this plan with her right before tribal council, which is a tactic still utilized nearly 20 years later. Ian also understands the perceptions of the jury. He runs the post-merge of Palau alongside the eventual winner Tom Wesson, but one factor that differentiates Ian from Tom was his willingness to flip. Ian knew that Tom would win the game in just about every final tribal council combination, so he intentionally placed the pieces on the board to knock out Tom at the final 4. We see this long-term strategic thought at the final 5 when Ian convinces Tom to knock out Karen, who was completely loyal to Tom. This move forced Tom to take out one of his pawns in the game, while Ian maintained Katie as a loyal ally and an easy beat in the end. Ian ultimately loses that season because Tom won immunity in every challenge from the final 5 onwards. If Tom loses immunity at final 3, Ian knocks him out and he likely destroys Katie in a jury vote. If Tom loses immunity at final 4, he goes home as well. In that case, Ian reaches the final 3 up against Jen and Katie, where I'm pretty confident that he wins the immunity challenge there. When analyzing these non-winners of Survivor, I'm constantly evaluating the intended path. Ian is a perfect example of a contestant that was en route to winning a season and lost due to the challenge side of the game. While you can definitely fault Ian for losing those immunities, it's still impressive that all the other pieces were in place. Socially, I'm confident in Ian's ability to win a jury vote the majority of the time that he reaches the final tribal council. I think Ian wins just about every possible scenario on Palau, with the exception of the Ian-Tom final tribal, but even in that combination, he has 2 locked jury votes in Katie and Kobe, so he only needs 2 more to clutch the win. With all these praises, why does Ian barely make it on the list? And the answer is his mindset and his resilience. By the end of the season, the physical and emotional wear on Ian is evident. At the Final Four, he openly admits that he was planning on targeting Tom, which causes Tom to send him into fire-making. At the Final 3, Ian forfeits individual immunity, which I don't fault him for given the length of the challenge. However, you can definitely criticize Ian for him asking Tom to vote him out in order to regain their friendship. It's a clear example of Ian getting emotionally manipulated in the game. Had Ian dropped out of the challenge and Tom voted him out in a normal tribal council, then I would probably rank him higher on this list. So like I said at the beginning, Ian is an incredibly underrated player of Survivor. If you're sleeping on him because of that last challenge, go back and watch Palau. He deserves a spot here in the top 50. Here at the number 49 spot, we have another contestant in that Challenge Beast archetype. It's the first winner to appear on this list, the sole survivor of Season 30 Worlds Apart, Mike Holloway. Now, my opinion on Mike as a Survivor player is very different from my thoughts on his winning game. I think Mike's win is one of the 10 worst in the history of the show, as he relies on challenges and idols to bulldoze his way to the end from the final 9. In fact, the core anti-Mike argument hinges on that idea of threat level management. Unlike other players in Mike's archetype who come forward as threats due to their challenge ability, Mike paints the target on his own back. At the final 9 of that season, Mike's aggressive approach in acquiring an advantage during the auction clearly presents him as an overly aggressive player. It is true that Mike's name was in serious circulation prior to that move, but the entire auction saga cemented his position on the bottom. That decision by Mike proves that he can sometimes play too hard. It's one of the primary reasons that places him relatively lower on this list. With that out of the way, here is the pro-Mike argument, which I obviously find a bit more compelling. First, we know that Mike can operate in multiple positions on Survivor. In the first half of the game, he directs the course of voting, leading both the Lindsay vote and the Joaquin vote in the pre-merge. Then, in the post-merge, he's a core member of the Majority Alliance that knocks out members of the No-Collar tribe. Then we have the second half of the game, which reveals Mike's ability to function on the bottom, scraping by through immunity wins and idol plays. Mike does not merely survive the game in that bottom position. He actively makes moves to disrupt the majority, which materializes in a level of control. At the final 8, Mike lies saying that he will use his immunity idol on the target Shirin, which intimidates some members of the majority to vote against their own. They essentially reveal the cracks of their own alliance due to Mike's work on the bottom. At the final 7, Mike leads the Tyler vote, which removes a major challenge competitor in the game, thereby increasing his chances of winning out from there. At the final 6, Mike advises Carolyn to play her idol correctly, which locks down their alliance for the rest of the season. At the final 5, Mike convinces the majority to vote out Sierra, which was completely against their best interest. Mike's flashy playstyle from the majority and the minority is one that I think often results in a win, especially in the modern era of Survivor, where juries praise these big moves. We need to remember that Mike burns many members of the jury on this cast through his actions at the auction, but his play combined with his final tribal council performance were strong enough to still warrant a win by a wide margin. We haven't even hit on Mike's challenge prowess, which is easily his most impressive asset. Mike wins 5 out of 9 individual immunities on Worlds Apart. He is one of just 6 contestants to win 5 immunities in a single season. He's the type of player that I believe reaches the merge almost every time that he competes due to this side of his game. I just think Mike is a more well-rounded player than people give him credit for because they primarily remember his challenge success. He lands here at number 49. Jumping ahead to the number 48 spot, we have the first old school contestant on this list. I expect this selection to come with a bit of pushback as I included this player over both winners from their 2 appearances. But here I have Kathy Vavrick-O'Brien from Survivor Marquesas and Survivor All-Stars. I think Kathy is one of the most innovative players in Survivor history. Prior to Survivor Marquesas, every season generally followed the same format, where the tribe that entered the merge with the numbers would knock out all members of the opposition, then fight it out from there. Kathy was the first contestant to deviate from that template. Her Row 2 tribe enters the merge with the 7-3 numbers advantage, yet Kathy is capable of recognizing her position on the bottom of that group. At the final 9, Kathy famously works alongside Sean Rector to orchestrate the first major flip in Survivor history by convincing Nalia and Pascal to betray their original tribe. Her run on Marquesas also demonstrated Kathy's understanding of positioning within the game, where she strategically places herself as the swing vote at the final 5 with Vecepia and Sean on one side and Nalia and Pascal on the other. When Kathy gains agency in the game, I'm confident in her making the correct strategic decision. In that final 5 tribal council, Kathy realizes that she has a better shot at beating either Nalia or Pascal in the final immunity challenge, so she sides with that duo. Kathy's adaptability is further evidenced by the final 4, where her original target of Vecepia wins individual immunity. At first, it looks like Kathy is the obvious boot, but she pulls Vecepia in order to force a rock draw. Kathy reaches the final 3 of Marquesas in a position where she wins the game by a landslide if she can earn a seat in the final tribal council. That win equity is another positive for Kathy, as I believe she is a player capable of winning a jury vote due to her dynamic playstyle. Now, you can definitely fault Kathy for her poor threat level management there, as neither Nalia nor Vecepia want to take her to the end. In fact, that duo worked together to ensure that Kathy does not reach that point. Kathy's run on Marquesas, while impressive, came with its own low points that hold her back on the list. Unfortunately, Kathy's archetype is one that will generally struggle in the early rounds of the game. She's positioned on the bottom of the original Row 2 tribe, such that if they attend a tribal council in the first 3 episodes, she more than likely gets voted out. But then we get to Survivor All-Stars, where once again, Kathy establishes herself as one of the best players from that era of the show. On the original Mogo Bogo tribe, Kathy is well positioned as she aligns with the women, as well as Lex from a pregame alliance. I really think that had Mogo Bogo entered the merge of that season with the numbers advantage, Kathy would have been in prime position to make a serious run. At the same time, I will admit that Kathy makes her worst strategic decision in her entire Survivor career on this season. In the last round of the pre-merge, Kathy pushes to keep Amber over Jerry, which later dooms her alliance as Amber and Rob flip against them in the post-merge. I struggle in determining how much to knock Kathy for this move, as it was based primarily on her relationship with Rob outside the game. This was a point in Survivor history where there was really no precedent for pre-game alliances. You could make the argument that this decision by Kathy reveals some excessive loyalty in her game, but I think her run on Marquesas largely contradicts that idea. In other words, when you put Kathy in front of a cast with no pre-game relationships, then she's willing to act more cutthroat. All in all, I genuinely considered putting Kathy higher on the list, but I struggled making that jump given the context surrounding her success. She dominated a very early era of the show, so while she was capable of playing a more dynamic game, I think that playstyle was generally easier when set up against a simpler strategic cast. I doubt that we will ever see Kathy return on Survivor, but if she could apply this approach to a modern season, she would move her way up the list. On to number 47, we have a one-time player, someone that competed on the show fairly recently, and someone that I would love to see return on Survivor 50. It's the final juror of Survivor Island of the Idols, Lauren Beck. Lauren is probably the best social player covered thus far on the list. On IOI, she forms connections across the board, which opens many strategic avenues outside her core alliance with players like Missy and Elizabeth. Lauren's social persuasion is really exemplified at the final 9, where she convinces 6 players to sit out of the immunity challenge in order to earn an idol. Granted, she plays the idol that same round in a spot where no votes are cast against her, but the social play is impressive nonetheless. That general likability also bolsters her chances of winning a jury vote. On IOI, I think Lauren beats most of her competitors in a jury vote, with the exception of Tommy, which could really go either way. I've discussed that final tribal council combination in the past, but if Lauren wins fire making against Dean, I think it's a 4-4 split between her and Tommy, where Jamal and Aaron would cast the winning votes of the season. Strategically, Lauren co-dominates the direction of votes for the entirety of that season alongside Tommy. She is a part of the consensus plan at nearly every tribal council that she attends. My real issue with Lauren's game is that I think Tommy completely outmaneuvers her. By the time Lauren reaches the late game, most of the remaining players, like Dan, Dean, Nora, and Janet, are all more loyal to Tommy than they are to Lauren. Not to mention, Lauren benefits from the Dan ejection at the final 6, and that Dan was another player that fell more into the Tommy camp than the Lauren one. I'll also criticize Lauren's suboptimal outlook on the final tribal council, as she was determined to reach the final 3 alongside Tommy, which was a significantly more difficult winning scenario for her. I question if Lauren has that killer instinct to flip on her allies at the opportune time. Tommy, by contrast, always planned on taking Lauren to the final 4 as a potential avenue to the end, but his ideal final 3 excluded Lauren. So I debated placing Lauren higher on the list due to her social game and her general win equity, but I don't think her strategic play was strong enough to warrant a higher spot. Had Lauren lost the season while coordinating some post-merge moves that advanced her game while damaging Tommy's, then she easily would have ranked a couple spots higher. On to number 46, we have one of the biggest characters in Survivor history. This is a player whose strategic game is oftentimes underrated due to their villainous reputation. It's Jonny Fairplay from Survivor Pearl Islands and Survivor Micronesia. My assessment of Fairplay as a Survivor contestant largely hinges on his first appearance. For those of you who don't know, Fairplay broke his jaw prior to the filming of Survivor Micronesia. Production denied him pain medication on the island, which essentially caused him to quit the game in the first episode. I don't fault Fairplay at all for that quit. It's essentially identical to a medical evacuation in my mind, meaning it's not really indicative of his player quality. So this means that Fairplay earned a spot in the top 50 with one legitimate run where he placed 3rd. Fairplay's strategic movement on that season is incredibly innovative as he builds upon the dynamic play style outlined by Rob Cesternino on season 6. He opens the season aligned with the core of Sandra, Rupert, and Krista. At the final 11, John fails to flip the game against Rupert, which infamously enrages Rupert after tribal council. Yet even after this misstep, Fairplay rebounds and reintegrates within that majority. In my opinion, that ability to flip against an alliance, then rebuild those connections, is Fairplay's most valuable asset. This skill is really evidenced in the post-merge of Pearl Islands, where he flips between alliances for 3 consecutive rounds between the final 8 and the final 6. For that stretch, Fairplay has a complete stranglehold on the direction of the game. While Sandra goes on to win the season, we need to acknowledge that Fairplay completely outclasses her strategically as he systematically knocks out her allies in Rupert and Krista. Now, not everything goes perfectly. Fairplay loses control at the final 5 in the Burton elimination, but I generally fault Burton more for that round than Fairplay himself. In that episode, Burton wins reward and selects Fairplay, thereby leaving the 3 women alone at camp with an opportunity to conspire against them. After the Burton boot, Fairplay continues his dynamic dominance of the season as he flips Lil on Dara. Fairplay's strategic flexibility is also shown through his alliance with Burton. Fairplay contributed to the Burton vote in the pre-merge, however they are able to come back together in the post-merge once Burton returns through the Outcast twist. Fairplay reaches the final 3 of Pearl Islands with a legitimate shot at winning the season. If he can win the final immunity challenge, he takes Lil to the end, where I think he earns enough jury votes to win, but it's close. I understand that the Pearl Islands jury claimed that Lil would win that season during the reunion, but that statement was made after Fairplay was highlighted as the biggest villain in Survivor history. He was hated by the audience, so the contestants were incentivized to favor Lil during the reunion. I'll also throw out that Fairplay winning the final challenge and taking Lil is not an outlandish expectation on his end. Both Lil and Sandra were poor challenge competitors, So I think Fairplay was pretty unlucky in that the final immunity naturally favored one of Lil's few physical strengths. While I'm very impressed by Fairplay's strategic reads, his resume comes with its own negatives, the biggest obviously being the social side of the game. Fairplay is a combative character that enters multiple arguments on Pearl Islands with players like Sandra and Rupert. That poor social play potentially costs him the win, as he's unable to convince Lil to take him to the final tribal due to their poor relationship. Even if Lil makes the correct strategic move in voting out Sandra at Final 3, it's not a guarantee that Fairplay defeats her in that final tribal council. Lil is widely considered one of the biggest goats in Survivor history. The jury disliked her return through the outcast twist, and they didn't get along with her on a personal level. Similar to another Survivor villain that we will cover later on this list, I know that Fairplay can intentionally navigate his way to the end, but I don't think he wins all the time that he reaches the final tribal. So balancing the strategic awareness with his piss-poor social play lands him here at number 46. Looking at number 45, we have a player that I actually perceive very similar to Ian Rosenberger due to the way that he exits the game, but anyways, here at 45, we have Rafe Judkins from Survivor Guatemala. Rafe is a difficult player to assess in that he holds an insane amount of agency in his one appearance, but I often disagree with his decisions enacted through that agency. In other words, Rafe's ability to connect with others and open strategic avenues is impressive, but he oftentimes makes decisions based out of emotion. The first half of his game is dominant as Rafe navigates into the majority alliance on his original Nakum tribe. He enters the merge with the 6-4 numbers advantage, where his alliance starts picking off those players on the bottom in Brandon and Bobby John. But then we get to the final 8, where Rafe starts voting according to personal feelings. In that round, you had Jamie, a member of Rafe's alliance who was largely disrespected by the rest of the cast, approach Rafe with the final 3 deal. This seemed like an optimal move for Rafe, and that Jamie was an easy beat in the end. But instead, Rafe worries that Jamie is growing overly paranoid, so he flips the vote onto him. Later on, at the final 5, Rafe targets Cindy, primarily due to her decision to not share the car reward. The most obvious example of Rafe's irrational playstyle was his decision to take Danny to the final 3. Danny was an original member of the Yasha tribe that was picked apart in the early merge. She had at least 3 out of 7 locked jury votes in Brandon, Bobby John, and Gary. Rafe had the opportunity to take out Danny at Final 4 and instead keep Lydia, who was a horrible challenge competitor. Knocking out Danny there would drastically increase Rafe's odds of reaching the Final 2 in his ideal scenario alongside Stephanie. Now, keeping Danny to Final 3 opens more pathways to the final tribal for Rafe in that both Stephanie and Danny were willing to take him to the end, but I don't see a lot of value in that Final 2 deal with Danny when he clearly loses that scenario. Last thing to throw out regarding Rafe's emotional voting tactics was him relieving Danny of their Final 2 deal. On one hand, you could argue that once Danny won final immunity, Rafe's season was already over. If Danny takes Rafe to the final tribal, she likely wins in a 6-1 vote, where Rafe only picks up the jury vote of Stephanie. On the other hand, I need to fault Rafe for essentially throwing in the towel. He rejects the opportunity to even present his case to the jury. That quote-unquote quit in the end is why I perceive Rafe and Ian in a similar way. Both were dominant strategic players that lost steam in the final round. Just like Ian, I worry that Rafe lacks a bit of that resilience to finish the job he started on a Survivor season. Another negative against Rafe is simply the lack of information. We have seen him dominate a season from the majority, but we don't know how Rafe responds when the numbers are not on his side. With all my criticism of Rafe's reasoning behind his maneuvers, I need to give him credit for his ability to both recognize his winning scenarios and orchestrate moves that undermine his allies en route to the end. Guatemala was the first season to integrate both new players and returning players. There was a strong anti-returning player sentiment amidst the jury, and Rafe utilized that perception to his advantage. He aligns with Stephanie LaGrossa, returning from Survivor Palau, and they intend on going to the final tribal council together. If Rafe sits in the end with Stephanie, he easily wins the season, potentially in a unanimous vote. This means that if either Rafe or Stephanie win that final immunity challenge, Rafe is the winner of Survivor Guatemala. We also need to acknowledge that Rafe gets very unlucky with the final immunity challenge itself in that it naturally favors Danny's height. All of this is to say that Rafe is closer to winning a season of Survivor than just about any other famous non-winner. I also want to recognize that Rafe did not simply bank on the jury's anti-returning player philosophy. He actively convinces Stephanie to make moves that damage her reputation. Stephanie herself admits that flipping on players like Jamie, Judd, and Cindy will burn those jury votes, but she follows Rafe anyway. Overall, I feel that Survivor Guatemala is one of those forgotten seasons in the franchise's history, which really hurts Rafe's reputation amidst the general fan base. Considering his strategic agency and suboptimal decision-making, I put Rafe here at number 45. At number 44, we have a player from the most recent season of Survivor at the time of this recording, that being Survivor 46. Admittedly, there is a natural element of recency bias here, and I took the time to consider if I was overrating this player due to the freshness of their season. After some reflection, I still think that this contestant did enough in his one appearance to sneak his way into the top 50. It's Charlie Davis. I think Charlie is one of the best strategic minds of the new era in that he understands positioning within Survivor. Charlie knows how to subtly change strategic positions within the game and excel from each of those spots. For the first half of the season, Charlie serves as Maria's second-in-command while cutting her long-term options in the process. In the pre-merge, Maria originally wanted to work with Charlie and the women of the Siga tribe. Charlie convinces her to not only knock out those players, but use her extra vote in the process. Then in the early merge, Maria develops a close bond with Tevin, and the Charlie-Maria partnership lead the charge against Tevin at the final 10. These are clear examples of Charlie excelling from that deputy position. He deceives Maria into eliminating her secondary allies, while Charlie maintained his pawns like Ben. Charlie's strategic flexibility is showcased later in the merge, where he is willing to flip against his number 1. At the final 8, he supports Maria's big move of flipping the vote on Tiffany, knowing that he already developed the necessary bonds outside their alliance. Following that vote, Maria comes across as the biggest threat on the beach, yet no one considers voting out Charlie as a means of weakening her. In fact, the exact opposite happens. Charlie gains strategic agency. He serves as the swing vote at the final 7. Then at the final 5, Charlie contributes to the Maria elimination, thereby proving that he has a cutthroat aspect to his game. Another incredible component of Charlie's strategic game is threat level management. Oftentimes in modern Survivor, those players with strategic say become immediate targets. Charlie is the exception to this rule. He maintained agency for the entire season while remaining safe at every tribal council outside the final 6. Charlie's ability to push the vote off himself derives from both his social play and his use of shields. On Survivor 46, there were 2 major jury threats in Q and Maria. Charlie expertly sets up their demises at the final 6 and the final 5 respectively. Charlie's understanding of positioning combined with his threat level management give me a lot of confidence in his ability to make a deep run on any given season. Charlie is much more than just a strategic game bot. He is a solid social player. Just about every member of the 46 cast got along with Charlie. Those connections materialized in strategic options, which we see at the final 4 when Ben elects to take Charlie to the final tribal council. Keep in mind that Ben selects Charlie due to their friendship rather than any real strategic purpose. This social game translates to jury votes as well. Charlie loses season 46 in a 5-3 vote. Had that season ended in a 4-4 tie, Ben cast the winning vote for Charlie. Simply put, Charlie was incredibly close to winning the final tribal against Kenzie and Ben. If you swap out Kenzie for Liz, who placed 4th on that season, Charlie undoubtedly wins that combination. Finally, on the physical side, Charlie wins 2 out of 8 individual immunities. He is strong enough in this arena to survive the pre-merge without appearing as a major challenge threat in the early post-merge. Charlie comes with his own set of flaws. First, I would describe Charlie as a good social player, but not a great one. He loses to Kenzie in the final tribal, primarily due to that side of the game. Second, I worry that Charlie's gameplay might come across as too subtle, to the point where a jury would believe that he coasted through the season. Charlie never makes a flashy strategic maneuver, which is sometimes required by modern juries. Overall, I think Charlie's single appearance is one of the 5 best losing finalist games in the franchise's history. Survivor 46 is still fresh, so I'll be interested to witness the development of Charlie's Survivor legacy as we move away from that season. At number 43, we have another new era player that I actually considered ranking below Charlie. I think there might be some pushback regarding the inclusion of new era contestants, but I found that every season of Survivor naturally produces at least one top 50 player. In fact, there are just 4 seasons without any representation on this list, those being Borneo, Thailand, Gabon, and Nicaragua, which makes sense as those seasons are largely remembered for their low-quality gameplay. But anyways, here at number 43, we have a player that I adored from a character perspective at the time of her season. It's the winner of Survivor 42, Maryanne Oketch. To me, Maryanne's win represents her respective era of the show. It's a socially based playstyle that involves floating within the majority for at least the first half and waiting to make your big move at the very end. For Maryanne, this meant operating within the Taku 4 alliance with little agency through the final 7. I feel like Maryanne's positioning within the Takus is subject to criticism. She was on the bottom of that group, such that had Taku attended another pre-merged tribal council, she likely gets voted out. However, you could partially attribute that poor positioning to the Jackson medical evacuation, in that it removed a player that would fall ahead of Maryanne in the pecking order. But even in the early merge, Maryanne proves that she is a contestant that may struggle to navigate into the majority. She is the original target of the Mergatory Tribal Council until she is saved by the work of Omer. Now, on one hand, you can credit Maryanne for her bond with Omer that ultimately saves her, but it's still a bad look for her and that others targeted her at all. Maryanne was also a potential target in the Split Tribal Council until you had the entire idol situation with her and Drea. It's really not until the final 6 that Maryanne takes the reins of the season through the Omer elimination, whereby Maryanne sends him home with the use of an extra vote. That move alone is a major reason why Maryanne lands in the top 50. It proves that she's capable of coordinating a strategically complex maneuver, something that cannot be said about many of the old-school contestants ranked below her on the list. It shows that Maryanne was willing to flip the game against her closest allies as well. Many people remember Maryanne for her happy-go-lucky personality, but that hyper-optimistic outlook never blinds Maryanne from making the ideal strategic play at the opportune time. There is also an element of self-awareness with that move. Maryanne understood that the first half of her game was largely uneventful. She knew that a big play was necessary at some point in order to improve her reputation in the eyes of the jury. We also need to highlight Maryanne's social play, which is the most valuable weapon in her arsenal. Despite coming across as a bit of a weirdo early on, Maryanne deepens her connections over the course of the season. She puts multiple advocates on the jury like Omer, Drea, and Tori. Her social play is especially apparent at the final 5, where Mike plays his immunity idol for her as an act of loyalty. Then at the final 4, her personal connection with Romeo is a large reason why Romeo elects to take her to the final tribal. This social component of Maryanne makes her a jury threat on any given season. I think Maryanne is the type of player that can win a jury vote against competitors with superior strategic resumes due to those connections. My primary concern with Maryanne as a player is that I think she's high variance. Maryanne fails to initially gain favor with her competitors, and when you combine that with her general struggles in the physical side of the game, you get a contestant that's always at risk of going home in the early pre-merge. I would also criticize Maryanne's outlook on the endgame. In the final tribal council, Maryanne claims that her pathway to the end was guaranteed at the final 4, which simply wasn't true. Both Mike and Jonathan revealed postseason that they did not want to sit in the end with her. Mike claims that he wanted to put himself into fire-making against Maryanne, while Jonathan says that he would have considered throwing Maryanne into fire against Mike. So while I think Maryanne's winning game is a lower middle-tier victory within the larger history of the show, I think she demonstrates enough in that run to make the top 50. She lands here at number 43. On to number 42, we have our first multi-time contestant to earn a spot on the list. Every other player featured up until this point in the top 50 has competed in a maximum of 2 seasons, so this selection feels a bit like a longevity award. But here at 42, we have Andrea Boehlke from Survivor Redemption Island, Survivor Caramoan, and Survivor Game Changers. I think Andrea is one of the most consistent players in the history of Survivor, which is evidenced by her placements. Across her 3 seasons, Andrea reaches the merge every time with varying levels of success. Now, to be fair, we should acknowledge the fact that Andrea's highest placing season was 5th. There is a concern for me in that Andrea has a history of coming forward as a target in the mid-merge. It has occurred in literally all 3 of her appearances. Just about every player surrounding Andrea on this list has a higher peak. That consistency still holds a lot of value, but I think all 8 contestants below her on the list have an opportunity to jump past her with another solid appearance. When discussing Andrea as a player, I think it's important to acknowledge the element of growth over her Survivor career. Andrea first competes on Survivor Redemption Island at the age of 21. By the time she comes back for her 3rd appearance on Survivor Game Changers, she's 6 years older. She is a more self-aware person and a better overall Survivor player. I think the modern version of Andrea is one of the most complete players we've ever seen in that she's above average in every facet of the game, social, strategic, and especially physical. In fact, Andrea is tied for 2nd all-time in Women's Career Immunity Challenge wins. From a strategic perspective, Andrea develops into a solid strategic player over the course of her 3 seasons. In every appearance, Andrea navigates into the majority alliance, but she constantly struggles to find inroads within that majority for the back half of the game. In Redemption Island, she was admittedly a bit clueless as she operated on the bottom of the Ometepe tribe ruled by Rob Mariano. Even when Andrea returns to the game through the Redemption Island twist, she's unable to convince the other players to flip against Rob. While the read of targeting Rob is correct, she still failed in this attempt. The Survivor Caramoan version of Andrea is definitely a more polished player. Once again, she navigates into the season's dominant alliance of Stealth R Us. She leads the Michael vote at the final 12, which was some impressive work, but Cochran outplays her and she goes home at the final 7 with an idol in her pocket. Finally, we reach Survivor Game Changers, which many consider Andrea's best performance. I still prefer her Caramoan run, but I understand the argument for this season. She's initially on the outside looking in for the early merge until Sarah flips over to her side at the final 11. At the final 10, she makes her bold strategic move in eliminating Zeke, which peaks her threat level, causing her alliance to flip against her at the final 8. Overall, Andrea earns her spot on this list through her consistency. Prior to Survivor Game Changers, I would probably exclude Andrea entirely. I'm all in favor of a 4th Andrea appearance to see if she can get over that hump in the mid-merge. She lands here at number 42. At number 41, we have one of the more controversial selections on this list. Some people will argue that this contestant deserves a spot in the top 10, while others would claim that he should fall outside the top 50. I fall somewhere in the middle, so here at 41, we have the greatest villain in Survivor history, Russell Hantz. Where do you even start with Russell? He is undoubtedly one of the best strategic minds to ever compete on Survivor. If you put Russell up against a cast that's unaware of his reputation, he is capable of strategically dominating the season and bulldozing his way to the end. He's literally done it twice in back-to-back seasons on Survivor Samoa and Survivor Heroes vs. Villains. There's an underrated element of flexibility in Russell's play style. Many people remember Russell for his work directing votes from the majority, but I feel that the most impressive aspect of Russell's strategic game is his ability to flip a season in his favor from the bottom. He completely shifts the power dynamics of the game in both seasons. In Samoa, his Foa tribe enters the merge down in numbers 8-4. Russell responds by idling out Kelly Starbaugh at final 11, then convincing John and Shambo to flip onto his side at final 10. These moves enable Foa to dominate the rest of the post-merge from the final 9. Russell's game on Samoa is, in my opinion, one of the 10 best losing finalist games in the franchise's history. Then in Heroes vs. Villains, Russell is originally positioned on the outside of the Villains tribe. Once again, he overcomes the odds, this time with arguably the most impressive idol play in Survivor history. He idols Tyson out of the game at Final 15, which establishes a new villain majority that later comprises 5 of the final 7. Meanwhile, Redemption Island was an impossible challenge for Russell. His Zapatera tribe of all new players literally throws an immunity challenge to vote him out. Given Russell's reputation, I really think there was a 0 chance of any collection of players allowing him to make a run. For that reason, I don't value the Redemption Island appearance as much as his previous 2. When operating from the majority, Russell knows how to carve his path to the end while cutting his allies' other options. In the pre-merge of Samoa, Russell convinces Natalie to knock out her closest ally in Ashley. At the final 7 of Heroes vs. Villains, Russell famously undermines Parvati, flipping the vote onto her number 1 ally in Danielle. But then we get to the central question of this entire ranking. How confident am I in Russell's ability to win any random season of Survivor? At its core, Survivor is a social game, and I worry that Russell's cutthroat playstyle, combined with his combative personality, greatly reduces his chances of winning a jury vote. On Samoa, I feel that Russell's poor social play is often blown out of proportion. While he definitely burns bridges with players like Monica and Laura, I found that many contestants like Dave Ball completely changed their minds upon entering the jury. Dave praises Russell in his exit interview, but he ultimately votes for Natalie in the end. Meanwhile, other members of the Samoa jury refuse to vote for Russell, not due to his hostility, but rather his deception within the game. Similar to Rob Mariano in All-Stars, Russell faced a jury that seemed to hate the deceptive nature of Survivor. For that reason, I attribute Russell's loss in Samoa more to the jury's outlook rather than a specific mistake in his social game. Heroes vs. Villains is a completely different story. There, Russell simply does not care about his relationships with members of the jury. He straight up calls Rupert a dumbass, effectively burning that jury vote. In the final tribal council, Danielle offers Russell the opportunity to apologize for his poor treatment of the other castaways, and Russell refuses to admit any wrongdoing. I know that Russell's strategic approach to the game is one that can take him far on any season, but I question Russell's chances of winning a jury vote. I think that his negative presence around camp will often cost him the win. A Russell victory probably requires a strictly strategically minded jury. If this list were based purely on the strategic side of Survivor, Russell is up there with the all-time greats, but for now, he lands here at 41. At number 40, we have another player that I know many people would expect to see higher on the list. This contestant is known for competing on 2 seasons of Survivor without ever getting voted out. It's Michele Fitzgerald from Survivor Co-Wrong and Survivor Winners at War. Admittedly, I have always been a bit lower on Michele as a player as compared to the general Survivor fan base. Obviously, she has the distinction of placing 1st and 3rd across her 2 appearances, and while that sounds impressive on the surface, you need to take a deeper look on how Michele reached those placements. Across both of her seasons, Michele struggles to navigate into a majority alliance. On Survivor Co-Wrong, she's positioned on the bottom from the final 8 onwards. She relies on a Joe medical evacuation and an immunity win to reach the final tribal council. While it's impressive that Michele was capable of winning those challenges at the very end, it's still a negative on her resume in that she was the target to begin with. Once again, on Winners at War, Michele operates outside the majority alliance. From the final 8 through the final 6, Michele is excluded from the consensus plan in every tribal council. She also needs immunity at the final 6, where she was the consensus target. For a large section of that season, Michele doesn't really know what's going on. Natalie's decision to take Michele to the end clearly proved that Michele was not a legitimate jury threat. She was carried to that point as an easy beat. In fact, by the final 4, Michele had 0 winning combinations against any pairing of Natalie, Tony, and Sarah. Maybe she wins the season if she rolls with Ben and Natalie to the final 3, but she contributes to the Ben elimination, so I guess she shot herself in the foot there. I really don't find Michele's Winners at War game all that impressive, which is why I question the title of the quote-unquote 2-time player that's never been voted out. All of this is to say that my primary reservation with Michele is her inability to finesse her way into a majority alliance. I'm not looking for Michele to be the head of the alliance, but I think her constant operation on the bottom means that she's always at risk of going home earlier. With that criticism in mind, I still rank Michele at number 40 because she knows how to build bonds with those other contestants on the bottom. On Co Wrong, Michele establishes multiple advocates on the jury in Scott, Jason, and Julia, who all functioned outside the majority alongside her. Granted, I think there was an element of bitterness from those jurors against Aubry, but the social play is clutch nonetheless. Michele combines those social connections with an ability to bulldoze her way to the end. She's got 4 career immunity challenge wins under her belt. I think Michele can win her way out to the end and cash in on her respective jury votes. At the end of the day, Michele has proven that her play style is repeatable. She can get towards the end of the game, but I wonder how often she actually wins. It's difficult to impress a jury consistently without ever holding any strategic agency. For those reasons, Michele falls here at number 40. On to number 39, we have another winner of the show. It's the winner of Survivor David vs. Goliath, Nick Wilson. Now, obviously I disagree with Nick's decisions outside the game of Survivor, but when you objectively examine him as a player, he is strong in all 3 facets of the game. I don't necessarily think that Nick is a master in one particular element, but he is surely one of the most well-rounded players in Survivor history. Strategically, Nick is an innovative thinker capable of overcoming a minority position. At the final 12 of David vs. Goliath, Nick famously pulls off the John Hennigan blindside with the minority vote split. It's one of the most impressive strategic maneuvers from that era of the show. Many people forget that the Goliaths held the numbers in that round to remain in control and simply pick off those Davids on the bottom. However, Alec felt so connected to Nick that he leaked the plan, which enabled the John blindside. Then in Winners at War, Nick loses his ally Wendell in the early merge. He's originally positioned on the outside of the majority, but he's able to find his way into that group. Granted, he's still outside that alliance's core, which is shown when the vote flips on him at the final 6. I also have a lot of confidence in Nick building a winning resume and finding his winning combinations. On David vs. Goliath, I think Nick beats just about any remaining player by the time of the final 6. I used to believe that Nick needed immunity at final 5 and final 4, but postseason interviews indicate that Nick was already locked into a final 3 deal with Mike and Angelina. In other words, Nick's path to the win was solidified by the final 5. There's 2 main strategic concerns with Nick. First, we have his initial struggles to enter the majority. It's been widely reported that Nick was a serious target for the first David's tribal council, and he greatly benefits from the Pat medical evacuation. If not for that situation, Nick potentially goes home in the first episode of the season. Second, we have never witnessed a clean Nick Wilson run. In both appearances, Nick blatantly loses control at some point in the post-merge. In David vs. Goliath, he's on the outs for the Carl vote at the final 9 and the Davey vote at the final 6. Nick does not handle his exclusion particularly well in the aftermath of those tribal councils. On Winners at War, he loses control at the Wendell vote at the final 12, and obviously the final 6 where he goes home. Physically, I know that Nick can win out if need be. He wins the last 3 individual immunity challenges on David vs. Goliath. You can debate the actual necessity of those immunity wins, but the athletic ability is impressive nonetheless. Finally, we get to the social side of the game where, shocker, Nick is above average. The cast of Season 37 worked according to their original tribal divisions for a large chunk of the post-merge. Nick was one of the few players to align across tribal lines. He forms connections with multiple Goliaths like Angelina and Mike, who he later defeats in the final tribal council. He also develops working relationships with Alec and Dan in the early merge, which enabled the Davids to momentarily take control. If you throw Nick into a modern season of Survivor featuring multiple swaps, I think he can adapt to his environment and form those necessary alliances in the different stages of the game. So ultimately, I ranked Nick at 39 because there's no real glaring weakness on his resume. He's solid in all 3 components of the game, he has a middle-tier win on David vs. Goliath, and he's a player that I would say has a decent shot at winning any random season of Survivor. Nick's lack of expertise in one particular area holds him back, but his well-roundedness earns him this spot at 39. At number 38, we have a player that I feel is drastically underrated by the general Survivor community due to her lackluster edit on her winning season. It's another new era player. It's Erika from Survivor 41. Immediately following Erika's win, I would have ranked her as one of the worst winners of the franchise and easily outside the top 50. However, when you put a magnifying glass to Erika's game alongside new information from the cast post-season, you will find that it's an upper middle tier winning game. She's your prototypical under-the-radar winner. She knows how to lay low, avoid the target, and gain agency over the course of the season. It's far from the flashiest winning game that we've seen, but fireworks and crazy blindsides are not necessary components of a great Survivor player. Erika's route to victory is fairly straightforward, and I think she shows enough in her single appearance to warrant this placement. I feel that the most important component of Erika's playstyle is her threat level management. Erika never makes a wild strategic play that magnifies her threat level amidst the cast. Rather, Erika maintains consistent agency throughout the season while functioning from the majority. She works into the power structure of the Luvu tribe in the pre-merge. There is one early episode where the edit highlights this storyline of Luvu attempting to throw an immunity challenge to eliminate Erika. It's actually revealed after the show that contestants attempted to throw that challenge to eliminate Sydney. Then in the post-merge, Erika is constantly safe within the game. She is a potential target in the Mergatory Tribal Council, but her targeting was due to the Hourglass twist itself, which she had no control over. Erika's ability to disguise herself as a non-threat is really evidenced by the Final Four, where Xander elects to take her to the Final Tribal, despite Erika having the best reputation with the jury. Erika partners her threat level management with an ability to take control of the game. Through the Shan vote at the Final 8, Erika sets herself up with a new alliance of 4 featuring herself, Xander, Heather, and Ricard. Erika was well connected with every member of that alliance. She had 2 easy beats in Xander and Heather that wanted to roll with Erika to the end. She also had Ricard as a shield to be taken out at Final 5. I would also note that similar to Maryanne, who we discussed earlier on this list, Erika understands the importance of timing within Survivor. In the early merge, Erika functions within the majority where she is safe, but she holds little strategic agency. She takes control of the game at the Final 7 and never looks back. I think Erika plays according to the landscape of her respective era. While you can criticize Erika in that she's missing a dominant game on her resume, I don't know if that particular play style would fare well on Season 41. In the scope of the new era, there are 2 winners that rank higher than Erika on this list. My hesitation with ranking Erika higher really derives from a lack of information. Erika's Luvu tribe wins every immunity challenge on Survivor 41. This means that Erika has attended just 7 tribal councils in her entire Survivor career. I don't know how Erika would perform in the pre-merge because she never needed to scramble in that stage of the game. I also don't know how Erika plays when the numbers are not on her side. Due to the success of Luvu, Erika enters the merge of 41 with more connections than just about any other player. I feel that the new era winners ranked higher than Erika have proven to excel from multiple positions in the game. Erika faces little adversity on 41, which is impressive in my evaluation of her winning game, but it hurts her player assessment. I feel that production will favor other new era winners for their next returning player season, namely Yam-Yam, Dee, and Maryanne. However, I personally would campaign for an Erika return so that we can see more sides to her game. She ranks here at 38. Looking at number 37, we have another winner whose winning game has declined a bit over time in my eyes. It's our second consecutive new era winner. It's Yam-Yam from Survivor 44. In my opinion, Yam-Yam is the best social player of the new era. His lighthearted sense of humor draws others in, thereby opening his strategic options and improving his general chances at winning a jury vote. On 44, Yam-Yam enters the merge with very few connections outside of Carson and Carolyn. His ability to establish close bonds enables the Tika 3 to operate the middle between the Soka and Ratu tribes. While I generally credit Carson more for the strategic decisions of that trio, Yam-Yam still plays a valuable role in that alliance. At the Final 7, his relationship with Jamie leads her to essentially give the Tikas the numbers advantage. At the Final 5, Yam-Yam knows that Lauren is the consensus target, but he throws a cautionary vote on Heidi in the event of an idol play. This move ends up being the correct strategic read as Lauren votes against Yam-Yam. If Lauren held an idol there, this decision theoretically saves him. You also need to credit Yam-Yam for his threat level management. Yam-Yam runs the post-merge of 44 alongside Carson, yet Carson is perceived as the bigger threat. When Heidi wins individual immunity at Final Four, Yam-Yam has a clear shield in front of him who Heidi challenges in firemaking. Finally, I respect Yam-Yam's tactic of writing his own winning arc as he competes on the island. Throughout the post-merge, Yam-Yam tells other contestants that those players who vote against him will go home in the subsequent tribal council. When Yam-Yam sits at the final tribal, his winning pitch felt authentic as other players heard this storyline for weeks. Yam-Yam's success on 44 proves that he can navigate through Survivor's most difficult minority positions. Now on to the negatives. I have 3 new era players ranked ahead of Yam-Yam on this list. There's a couple components of Yam-Yam's playstyle that are open to criticism, but the biggest for me is his outlook on the final tribal council. Yam-Yam fails to identify his ideal winning combinations. He consistently targets Carolyn in the endgame, and he's talked out of this plan by Carson. We later learn that Carolyn was not well respected by the jury, as she does not receive a single jury vote. Meanwhile, Yam-Yam helps Carson in firemaking at Final Four, indicating that he was willing to face Carson in the final tribal. If Carson reaches that point, I think he beats Yam-Yam. Carson locks down the jury votes of Kane, Danny, Lauren, and Brandon. He only needs one more to guarantee the win. You can also criticize the lack of evidence for Yam-Yam operating as an independent strategist. As mentioned earlier, he works alongside Carson for just about the entire season. More often than not, Carson gets his way, an example being the Final 8 Franny vote. In fact, Yam-Yam attends Tribal Council without Carson just twice on this season. In one of those instances, he has no control due to the composition of the swap, so I don't fault Yam-Yam too much for that round. In the other instance, Yam-Yam is on the outs for the Sarah boot. I need to see Yam-Yam compete again without an ally directing the ship. He ranks here at 37. It only makes sense to follow up Yam-Yam at 37 with his running mate at 36 in Carson Garrett. I expect many people to disagree with this selection. After all, Yam-Yam defeated Carson in Season 44. How could he be the better player of the two? We need to look back at the central question of this ranking. How confident am I in each player's ability to win a random season of Survivor? While Yam-Yam narrowly squeaks out the win over Carson on 44, I believe that if both competed 100 times on the show, Carson racks up more victories. I describe Carson as one of the more underrated social contestants of the last 3 years. 3 players swap tribes on Survivor 44, and only one of them actually integrates into their new group. Josh and Jamie come forward as immediate targets on their new tribes, while Carson establishes legitimate connections on Ratu. Later on at the Final 8, Carson blindsides Carolyn by flipping the vote on her ally Franny. Following that move, there was a concern that Carolyn would go rogue, but Carson pulls her back into the Tika alliance. In fact, Carolyn unnecessarily plays her idol on Carson in the following round. Carson's social prowess is further evidenced at the Final Four, where Yam-Yam helps him in firemaking despite Carson's potential to win a jury vote. You can make the argument that Yam-Yam's decision there was outside the game, but there's no denying that it was a poor strategic read. If Carson reaches the final tribal against Yam-Yam, he has 4 locked jury votes in Danny, Brandon, Lauren, and Kane. He needs just one more to guarantee the win. Strategically, Carson does a great job at positioning himself in the middle across various scenarios. In the first Tika Tribal Council, Carson is the key swing vote that eliminates Helen and officially establishes the Tika 3 alliance. Many fans will remember Season 44 as the season of Tika, but that group does not exist without Carson's decision in the early game. In the early merge, Carson serves as the head of intel for the Tika 3. He acquires information from both the Ratu and Soka tribes, which enables the Tikas to pit the two groups against each other. In the later merge, Carson's relationship with Lauren allows the Tikas to gain the numbers at the Final 6. This is all to say that Carson dominates the merge of 44 alongside Yam-Yam, and I found that Carson generally won their strategic disagreements. He had more say in the actual direction of votes. While Carson's maneuvering through the game is top-notch, other players eventually catch on to him. He is easily the biggest threat on the board by the Final 5, where if he loses immunity there, I think there's a chance that the other players band together against him. At the Final 4, Carson is perceived as such a massive threat that Heidi forfeits individual immunity to challenge him in fire. Carson's inability to remain undercover in the late game draws some concern for me. I feel that Carson is the type of player that wins more often than not when he sits in the final tribal, but the actual route to the end is difficult. It likely requires either immunity wins or a fire-making victory, which, to be fair, are still possibilities for him. I don't fault Carson too much for losing fire-making to Heidi, as I believe she sets a fire-making record. Carson is also a high-quality challenge competitor, winning 2 out of 8 individual immunities, so bulldozing his way to the end is not impossible by any means. As my opinion of Yam-Yam's winning game declines slightly over time, my thoughts on Carson as a non-winner generally improve. Whenever I rewrite this list in the future, I would not be surprised if Carson bumps up a couple spots. But for now, he is here at 36. At number 35, we have one of the most underrated contestants in the history of Survivor. This player's single appearance is in the conversation for the best non-winning game of all time. It's Devon Pinto from Survivor Heroes versus Healers versus Hustlers. I first watched season 35 about 2 years after its original air date, and in my binge through the season, I was consistently impressed with Devon's game. The editing of the season really highlights Chrissy as this scrappy underdog, and as a result, many people today seem to believe that Chrissy wins if not for the introduction of the forced fire-making challenge. I don't buy into that take. I think Devon thoroughly outplays Chrissy, and he held the necessary jury votes to win if he reached the end, hence why Devon ranks this high on the list, while Chrissy was excluded from the top 50 in its entirety. I consider Devon an expert of assembling a majority alliance and recognizing the ideal time to pivot away from that group. Devon was a part of the consensus plan at every tribal council that he attended on this season. Granted, Devon does not always get his way due to idle plays, but that's beside the point. He's in the majority on the original Hustlers tribe. At the merge, he functions within that alliance between the Hustlers and Heroes while carving out his core group of himself, Lauren, Ashley, and Ben. That group of 4 dominates the mid-merge, and when it implodes at the final 7, Devon correctly flips and establishes a new primary alliance with Ryan and Chrissy, who he rides with to the endgame. Devon partners this ability to navigate into the majority with some expert threat level management. Devon knew that he initially comes across as this relaxed, non-threatening surfer bro, and he utilized that perception to his advantage. Devon does not have a single individual immunity win on Triple H, yet no one writes down his name until the final 5. Devon's overall persona is a major reason why Chrissy and Ryan elect to align with him over a player like Dr. Mike, who was an easy beat in the final tribal. Last thing to hit on with Devon's strategic game is his capacity to coordinate some outside-the-box maneuvers. In the early merge, Devon concocts the plan to disguise Ben as a part of the minority alliance in order to acquire intel. At the final 5, Devon saves himself by anticipating another Ben idle play and casting his vote against Dr. Mike. All of this is to say that I have a lot of confidence in Devon finding his group, remaining safe within that alliance, and coordinating votes to clear his path to the end. Unfortunately, Devon is one of the unluckiest contestants in Survivor history. First, you have Ben disrupting Devon's schemes by finding 3 consecutive idols, which features an element of resilience, but there's also a lot of luck there. Then you get production surprising the cast by introducing the forced fire-making challenge at the final 4, which sends Devon home. Without that twist, Devon reaches the final tribal council against Chrissy and Ryan, where he likely wins the season. In an 8-person jury, I think Devon has the locked votes of Ashley, Cole, and Dr. Mike. From there, I think he picks up the votes of Desi and Lauren, winning the season in a 5-2-1 jury vote. Keep in mind that this winning scenario for Devon hinges on a normal vote at the final 4. If Devon defeats Ben in fire-making, then he likely wins the season by an even greater margin. There's 2 main faults to point to with Devon. First, you have his under-the-radar playstyle. While this approach clears Devon's path to the end, it may hurt him in the final tribal. Some jury members like Joe perceive Devon as a clueless floater. Now, I personally believe that Devon could articulate his game and overcome those perceptions in the end, but we never see him actually jump this hurdle. Second, you can critique Devon's threat level management in the end game, where Chrissy elects to send him into fire-making against Ben. Now, I constantly say on this page that placement is not indicative of player quality, but I feel that Devon is a case where a win on Season 35 would have caused him to leap up the list due to the additional information acquired through that win. As it stands now, I don't know how Devon operates in front of a jury. I don't know how he combats jury members who disrespect his under-the-radar play style. In a theoretical world where Ben goes out at Final Four and Devon shines in the final tribal, we could be looking at a top 15 player of all time. Instead, my analysis is based a bit more on hypotheticals, which lands Devon here at 35. Breaking up this recent string of modern players, we have an old-school contestant. It's the first golden boy of Survivor, Ethan Zohn from Survivor Africa, All-Stars, and Winners at War. My opinion of Ethan as a player has improved over his subsequent seasons. I think Ethan's win on Africa is oftentimes overrated by the general fan base due to his outlook on the final tribal. For most of that season, Ethan operates as a strategic second-in-command to Lex. Ethan actually intended on going to the final tribal council with Lex, where, according to postseason interviews, Ethan would have lost. Ethan gets very lucky in that Kim Johnson won final immunity and takes him to the end. He essentially needed another contestant to do the dirty work of cutting his number one ally. I worry that Ethan lacks a killer element to his game. I don't know if he's capable of putting his personal relationships aside in order to complete the necessary strategic move. That cutthroat side of the game becomes more important now that we're a bit higher on the list. To be fair, Ethan makes some deceptive moves in his Survivor career. After the tribe swap on Africa, Ethan leads the first throne challenge in Survivor history in order to ensure the original Boron numbers at the merge. Then at the final 8, Ethan coordinates the Brandon blindside, effectively cutting one of Lex's connections outside their alliance. Through these moves, Ethan proves that he can play a savvy strategic game, but he's never willing to go all the way in and break his closest bond. Where Ethan really excels is his social positioning. On Africa, Ethan maintained a large pool of players that wanted to take him to the end in Big Tom, Lex, and Kim Johnson. Ethan's positioning within the Boron Alliance specifically is really impressive. Ethan was the third member roped into that group, so when they eventually needed to flip on each other at the Final Four, I expected Ethan to come forward as the consensus target. The opposite actually happens as Ethan becomes the swing vote. He had positioned himself at the center of the Boron Alliance. If Ethan competed on Africa and he never returned to Survivor, I would rank him somewhere in the 41 to 50 range. His subsequent appearance on Survivor All-Stars specifically reaffirmed multiple key aspects of his game, even though he finished in 11th. On that season, Ethan overcame higher strategic hurdles than really any other player. The cast of All-Stars adapted a real anti-winner sentiment. There were 4 winners on the cast, and all of them were voted out in their first tribal council except one, and that's Ethan. To be fair, he is on the outside of the consensus plan more often than not, but Ethan was still strong socially and physically enough for his tribes to keep him around. He gets 2 rounds away from reaching the merge, and if Ethan can make it to that point, who knows what happens. I feel that Ethan's all-star run really proved that he can operate on the bottom. I think that Ethan, in his physical prime, is the type of player that reaches the merge almost every time that he competes. Winners of War is a bit rocky. Ethan struggles to adapt to the modern game, and his run was fairly brief. But I just feel like Ethan is a very balanced player, solid in all 3 aspects of the game, but his strengths definitely lean more towards the social and physical sides. I'll rank him here at number 34. At number 33, we have a player who holds the record for most votes negated by immunity idols in a Survivor career. It's the standout star from Survivor Cambodia, Kelley Wentworth. Wentworth is obviously a modern legend of Survivor, and with that legendary reputation, I feel that some fans will overrate her as a player, especially her Cambodia game. On that season, Wentworth is perpetually outside the majority alliance without a lot of insight into the voting dynamics. She relies on idols and immunities to eventually land in 4th place. Now, on one hand, it's impressive that Wentworth proved that she could survive on the bottom with significant win equity. I think that if Wentworth reaches the end of that season, even against Jeremy, she wins the whole thing. On the other hand, we need to acknowledge that we've never seen Wentworth really excel from the majority. There's a couple players ahead of Wentworth on this list that follow a similar arc in terms of their gameplay. Chris Doherty from Survivor Vanuatu, for example, is on the bottom in the early merge, but takes control at the final 7. That's not the case for Wentworth. She never grabs the game by the horns in her entire Survivor career. To me, that's a massive component missing from her game. I faulted Michele earlier on this list for her inability to navigate into a majority alliance, and the same logic applies to Wentworth to a lesser extent. There are moments where Wentworth positions herself well socially. In her first appearance, she's well insulated on the original Hanapu tribe. Her game is largely screwed over by an unlucky tribe swap that sends her home in 14th place. Then on Edge of Extinction, Wentworth lasts longer than any other returning player, despite having arguably the biggest reputation of the returnees. There, she's in the majority alliance on the original Manu tribe and the swapped Lesu tribe, connecting with players like Wardog and Lauren. Her early merge on EOE is solid as well, though I disagree with some of her decisions, like knocking out David at Final 10, who was a clear shield for her. While Wentworth falls in 10th place on that season, it's the cleanest run in her Survivor career, one where she actually maintains a degree of control and safety simultaneously. I know it's not as iconic as her Cambodia game. You don't have her negating 12 votes with an idol. In fact, she goes home with an idol in her pocket. But Wentworth's EOE performance boosted her greatly in my rankings. Without that run, I'd at least put Wentworth below some non-winners like Devon and Carson. Rounding out Wentworth as a player, she's great physically, such that I doubt she ever gets voted out in the pre-merge due to challenge strength. I know that Wentworth has said in the past that she's done with Survivor, but I think she still has the potential to move her way up this list by competing out another season with some extended time in the majority. She lands here at 33. At number 32, we got a player that reminds me of Wentworth in that they both came from the same era of the show, have a similar play style, but I believe that this contestant has proven to work in a wider range of strategic positions, and that's Spencer Bledsoe from Survivor Cagayan and Survivor Cambodia. Spencer's Survivor resume is particularly interesting in that his 2 appearances showcase 2 entirely different play styles. Spencer's Cagayan game is a bit of a disaster in that he primarily operates from the bottom without any real strategic agency. He votes correctly in just 3 out of 8 post-merge tribal councils, and he's largely outclassed by Tony Vlachos flipping between groups. Spencer only lasts to the final 4 due to challenge wins and idle plays, which I don't consider a very reliable approach. Just like Wentworth, it's impressive that Spencer could survive on the bottom and potentially win from that position. Spencer walks away from Cagayan believing that his social game requires the most improvement, but I actually found his relatability the best component of his first appearance. Outside his constant feuds with Chaos Cass, the rest of the Cagayan cast loved Spencer. It's clear watching Spencer's Ponderosa videos that he wins the game if he reaches the end, even if it's against Tony. The jury straight up tells him that they were all planning on voting for him. Following season 28, Spencer would easily rank outside the top 50. It's his Cambodia game that really launches him into my top 10 non-winners of all time. On that season, Spencer proves that he can adapt and overcome that bottom feeder position, something that he could not accomplish in his first run. Early on, the game flips against Spencer in episode 2, and he kind of coasts outside the majority for the rest of the pre-merge. It's not until the merge where Spencer re-ingratiates himself with the power players of the season, and the strategic side of his game flourishes. He coordinates the Fishbach blindside at the final 9, effectively making Jeremy more dependent on him as an ally. At the final 6, Spencer correctly anticipates Kimmy flipping against their alliance, thereby causing Jeremy to save himself with an idol. The second half of Cambodia goes exactly according to plan for Spencer as he reaches the final tribal with Jeremy and Tasha. The problem with Spencer is that his outlook on the endgame was straight up wrong. By the time of the final 4, Spencer is in a position where he loses the season no matter what, as both Jeremy and Wentworth would have defeated him in the end. This endgame reveals multiple major flaws in Spencer as a player. First, this updated version of Spencer fails to connect with the jury in the same way as the Cagayan version. Spencer lacks that lovable aura that you see in a player like Maryanne. I think he requires a superior strategic resume in order to win a season. To be fair, there were winning scenarios for Spencer on Cambodia. He likely wins against any combination of Tasha, Keith, and Abby Maria. Second, Spencer fails to identify his own winning stock and pinpoint his winning combinations. Spencer had the opportunity to take out Jeremy at Final 5, and he passed it up. He rolls with Jeremy and Wentworth to the Final 4, which was just a losing scenario for him. At the end of the day, Spencer is just the type of player that I can expect to make a deep run on any given season. I don't necessarily know how well he can position himself for the win in the end, but that general adaptability, the capacity to play from the top or the bottom, holds a lot of weight for me. It ranks him here at number 32. At number 31, we got a contestant whose winning game is straight up dominant, but their player quality does not necessarily match. It's Tina Wesson from Survivor Australian Outback, All-Stars, and Blood vs. Water. Tina is obviously a historical figure within Survivor. Second winner ever, first woman to win the show, and the founder of the Onion Alliance. I'm very high on Tina's winning game. It's somewhere in my top 15 of all time. There, Tina proved that she could really run a season strategically from the majority. She sets up this very stable power structure of 5 Oga Corps members with a core 3 of herself, Keith, and Colby. That trio directs the course of voting for the entire season. Tina votes correctly in every tribal council with legitimate agency. She makes some impressive moves along the way, like the Mitchell boot where Tina pulls Colby onto her side. Tina also demonstrates some stellar late game positioning. When the numbers boil down to her core 3, Tina is in a spot where both Keith and Colby wanted to take Tina to the end, and she wins in either scenario. She effectively had the season won by that point. Tina's jury management was particularly impressive as well. She narrowly defeats Colby in a 4-3 jury vote, but this came in an earlier era of the show where jury members placed more of an emphasis on the physical side of the game. Colby won 5 individual immunities, but Tina was so well respected that she still won the season. Tina's winning game proved that she could establish a legitimate alliance, run the game, and maximize her winning scenarios in the end. At the time of her win, Tina would have been the greatest player of all time in my eyes. But when you take a deeper look into Tina's win, there are some holes in her approach that dropped her on the list. First, you have the fact that Tina wanted to go to the end of the game with Colby. She narrowly wins that scenario, which is great, but there were easier options on the table. The third member of Tina's core alliance in Keith was largely disrespected by the cast. He was an easy beat in the end, yet Tina was unwilling to break her bond with Colby. I worry that Tina lacks a bit of a killer instinct. Another drawback with Tina is her outlook on those post-merge eliminations. Tina justifies many of her votes as knocking out those contestants who, quote-unquote, don't deserve to be there. She approaches the game more from a personal angle than a strategic one. My concern is that Tina's connections will blind her to the optimal strategic move. We see on Blood vs. Water that Tina felt so close to Aris that she wanted to take him to the end where she potentially loses. I know that some people may rank Tina higher as she was technically one immunity challenge away from winning Blood vs. Water and becoming the second 2-time winner of the show. But we need to keep in mind that Tina was only in that position to win that season due to the Redemption Island twist, so that distinction doesn't hold much weight for me. The only season that I have not mentioned in my review of Tina is her All-Stars game, and that's because she's the first boot. I don't fault Tina too much for her elimination due to the anti-winner sentiment of the cast, but it's at least worth noting. Overall, Tina remains an incredibly innovative player, someone that really advanced the early strategy of Survivor. It earns her this spot at number 31. Moving ahead to number 30, we have a player that I considered ranking below Tina, but I just find this contestant's first appearance so impressive. It's Aubry Bracco from Survivor Co-Wrong, Game Changers, and Edge of Extinction. Aubry, to me, is a high-variance player. She's someone that may struggle a bit in the early game, which we see on Season 38 where Aubry is the first boot of her tribe. Granted, Aubry entered that season with a massive target on her back as a returnee, but even in Co-Wrong, Aubry initially struggles to navigate into the majority with her early breakdowns. I think if Aubry competed in 100 seasons, there would be a solid number where she goes out early. However, when Aubry can get over that initial hump, she's proven to make deep runs from different strategic positions. On Ko Rung, Aubry is in the power seat from the final 8 onwards, reaching the final tribal and placing second. Then on Survivor Game Changers, she's completely outside the majority and scraping by in the post-merge, but she still reaches 5th place. Aubry's Ko Rung game is easily her most memorable. That run specifically showcases her ability to cater her approach when working with different players. At the final 8, she completely manipulates Ty into flipping against Scott Pollard through an emotional appeal. This decision was against Ty's best interest, but Aubry knew how to push the right buttons in order to achieve her desired outcome. Aubry is in the driver's seat for the second half of that game, and I don't think people really appreciate how close she came to winning. Aubry originally intended on going to the final 3 with Joe and Ty, where I think she wins in spite of a pretty bitter jury. This plan is disrupted at the final 5, where Joe gets medically evacuated from the game. Without that medevac, Michele goes home at final 5, and then it's only a matter of defeating Sydney in the final immunity challenge. I have 2 main criticisms with Aubry's Ko Rung game. The first is her near elimination at the merge, where she's essentially saved by the Neil medical evacuation. The second is her jury management. It's a bad look for Aubry in that her elite strategic game was overshadowed by the jury's feelings towards her. There were multiple members of the jury who felt burned by Aubry, namely Scott, Jason, Julia, and Debbie. With that said, I don't consider Aubry a poor social player because the Game Changers jury adored her. She goes out at final 5 where she's easily the biggest jury threat on the board. She likely defeats any combination of the remaining players. Now, I know many viewers lowered their opinion of Aubry after her Edge of Extinction run, which is admittedly her worst performance, though even there, Aubry highlights a different side of her game in Fighting Idols, which is something that we didn't see the first 2 times. So while I consider Aubry a high variance player, I think she's one of the best strategic minds from her era of the show. I trust her ability to recognize her optimal path and at least attempt to coordinate the votes in that direction. She has not won a season of Survivor in her career, but I think she's capable of winning any random season. I'll rank her here at number 30. At number 29, we have another non-winner with one of the best final juror games in Survivor history. It's David Wright from Survivor Millennials vs. Gen X and Survivor Edge of Extinction. David's game on Season 33 is the primary reason for his high ranking on this list. David makes so many impressive moves on that season and survives all the way to the Final 4 despite his obvious reputation as a jury threat. Other contestants target David as early as the final 10, which is obviously a knock against him in the arena of threat level management, but I also find it impressive that David was able to keep his closest allies loyal. We see this at the final 5, where Ken and Hannah had the prime opportunity to take out David, yet they allow him to stay in the game for another round over Brett, who never held a lot of winning stock in the eyes of the jury. When you look at David's navigation through Millennials versus Gen X, he's proven to make some savvy strategic moves. His idol play for Jessica in the pre-merge is one of the best idol plays in Survivor history. That move locked down an ally that later drew a rock for David's alliance. Even when the tides turn against David, he knows how to overcome difficult scenarios. His group loses the rock draw at final 10, yet they're able to regain the numbers at the final 9, pulling Will Wall onto their side. Now, to be fair, I generally give Adam a bit more credit for that play, but it's still an impressive round for David in that he survives the Tribal Council in spite of his reputation as the best player in the game. Outside David's strategic side, I think he understands the importance of crafting a narrative while competing. David presents himself as the ultimate underdog that overcame his inner demons. Now, that storyline paints a target on David's back, which is not great, but it also ensures that he wins the season if he can reach the final Tribal Council. I have no doubt that David wins potentially unanimously against any combination of Adam, Ken, and Hannah. On Edge of Extinction, David was nowhere near as dominant as he goes out in the early merge, partially due to his reputation as a returning player. I will note that David faced an insane challenge on EOE. I doubt that any modern cast of new players would allow a returnee to go that far. But even then, David still finds a way to remain undercover and push the spotlight on Wentworth for the early section of the game. As for the negatives with David, I think that similar to Aubry, he is high variance. David is not a particularly strong challenge competitor, so I could see him going home early due to that aspect. In addition, David struggles emotionally in the early game of Season 33. I doubt that a modern David would experience the same thing, but it's important to acknowledge that David initially failed to find inroads on the Gen X tribe. Other major negative with David is his threat level management. I mentioned it before, but I worry that David is the type of player that peaks too early. He's someone that comes forward as a threat in the later game, but he does not have the challenge ability to bulldoze his way to the end. By presenting as a major threat, I also question David's control in his first run. It seems clear in the edit that Hannah wanted to keep David around as a shield for the final 4, a spot where David would likely lose final immunity. Overall, when I evaluate David as a contestant, I see him as an upgraded version of Aubry. He's high variance, but I have more trust in David actually winning a jury vote. I'll rank him here at number 29. At number 28, we have one of the most influential members of the Survivor community. I feel that this player is sometimes underrated in terms of his work in the advancement of Survivor strategy. It's Rob Cesternino from Survivor the Amazon and Survivor All-Stars. Rob completely changes the game of Survivor. On Season 6, he pulls off the most fluid strategic game seen up until that point. Season 4, Survivor Marquesas marked the first flip in Survivor history, but Rob was really the first contestant to flip multiple times in the post-merge. On that season, Rob navigates into the periphery of the main power structure in the pre-merge, and he proceeds to flip between alliances at the final 7, the final 6, and the final 5. This dynamic playstyle is particularly impressive given the era in which Rob competed. Players at that time were generally more loyal, so it's wild that Rob was capable of regaining others' trust after stabbing them in the back. And that's a part of Rob's game that I feel is often overlooked. Rob knew how to customize his arguments to the individual, which opened up his strategic options. Another positive with Rob is his ability to tactically form alliances. For the majority of Season 6, Rob is aligned with Butch and Matt, who take orders from him on multiple votes. Rob intended to go to the final 3 with that trio, where he defeats either one of them in a final tribal council. This plan is disrupted by Jenna winning the final 2 immunity challenges, and if not for those challenge wins, Rob is in prime position to win the season. Even if Rob faced Jenna in the end, I think there's a legitimate argument that he still comes out on top. Jenna locks down the jury votes of Alex and Heidi, while Rob picks up Butch, Matt, and Dina. From there, the season is essentially decided by Dave and Chrissy, and I lean towards Rob pulling out the win. I have 6 non-winners ahead of Rob on this list. There's a couple factors that hold him back in the ranking. First, I think that Rob is a contestant that generally struggles in the early game. In both Survivor the Amazon and Survivor All-Stars, Rob fails to navigate into the core of the majority on his original tribe. Over time, Rob warms up to people and eventually positions himself at the center, but there is a concern for me that Rob could go home early on any given season due to those initial struggles. In fact, Rob is the first boot from his tribe on All-Stars, but that was more so due to his reputation entering that season. Of the non-winners there, Rob walked in with the biggest target on his back. Second drawback with Rob is his threat level management in the late game. While the general Survivor fan base often reflects on Matt as this non-strategic player, it's important to remember that Matt was willing to cut Rob in the end. He intentionally threw the final immunity challenge to Jenna, knowing that Jenna would take him to the final tribal council over Rob. I think Rob knows how to develop a wide range of connections across the beach, but he doesn't keep those alliances intact through the end of the season. So overall, I have a lot of respect for Rob, both as a Survivor player and as a member of the media surrounding the show. RHAP was the first Survivor podcast that I followed, and it played a role in the eventual creation of this channel. He's one of the best non-winners of all time. I'll rank him here at 28. At number 27, we have a contestant who plays one of the best non-winning games of all time. It's a player who remains heavily involved in the Survivor community. It's Stephen Fishbach. I genuinely considered ranking Stephen higher on this list. My opinion of his game on Tocantins continues to elevate over time. Stephen showcases so much strategic acumen in that one appearance. His Jalapao alliance enters the merge in a 6-3 numbers disadvantage, yet they completely flip the game in their favor by pitting the factions of the Timbira tribe against each other. Throughout that run, I think Stephen does a phenomenal job at positioning himself well for the future. And working alongside JT, Stephen typically gets his way, which results in a better individual position that undermines JT in the process. In the post-merge, Stephen convinces JT to take out multiple contestants that were completely loyal to him, like a Brendan and a Coach. Instead, that duo rides with Aaron to the final 3. Aaron was one of the few contestants that did not fully buy into JT's aura. If JT loses final immunity, Stephen votes him out and easily beats Aaron in a final tribal council. JT winning the last 3 immunity challenges obviously ruins this plan, but I still give Stephen a lot of credit for recognizing the optimal strategic move. Another underrated part of Stephen's game is the social side. Many people remember Stephen's loss to JT in a unanimous jury vote and assume that his social game was suboptimal. We need to keep in mind that JT's Tocantins run is one of the best social games of all time. JT defeats literally anyone in a final tribal council. Stephen, on the other hand, would probably beat any player in the end with the exception of JT. I think that Stephen is the type of contestant capable of winning a jury vote, but he was dealt a difficult scenario in the end. Stephen's social game also translates to legitimate allies. On Tocantins, he locks down his alliance with JT, which results in JT taking him to the final tribal over Aaron, who was viewed as weaker competition. Then on Survivor Cambodia, Stephen solidifies a number 1 ally in Jeremy, who later plays his idol for Stephen at the final 10. Stephen is one of the best strategic thinkers in Survivor history, so I have a lot of trust in his ability to identify the best maneuver, but I question if Stephen can actually gain the numbers for his various schemes. On Tocantins, I will admit that Stephen was at points reliant on JT as the face of the operation, the player that would pull others onto their side. Then on Cambodia, Stephen initially struggles to gain the trust of other castaways as he's perceived as a hyper-aggressive strategic player. This untrustworthy image of Stephen makes him the consensus target at the final 10 and the final 9. So it's kind of funny that somehow I landed on Rob and Stephen in back-to-back spots. Obviously, I see Stephen as the slightly better player. I got him ranked here at 27. At 26, we have a contestant whose ranking has featured the widest range in my drafts for this list. At points, I considered putting this player in the top 20, and at other times, I debated dropping them into the mid-30s. That player is John Cochran. So here's my dilemma with ranking Cochran. His first season is an absolute disaster, while his second appearance is one of the best winning games of all time. In evaluating Cochran, I needed to figure out which run was more representative of his potential as a player. Obviously, I lean more towards his game on Karamoan, but his South Pacific performance is still worth noting. He spends the entire pre-merge of Season 23 scraping by on the bottom of the Savai'i tribe. I think that this section of the game reveals an inherent flaw with Cochran in that he's someone that generally struggles to develop those early working relationships. Combine that with his below-average skill set in the physical department, and you get a player that is constantly at risk of going home in the pre-merge. In fact, Cochran would have been voted out at the final 12 if not for the Redemption Island twist. At the merge, Cochran famously elects to flip over to the opposing Upolu tribe. Now, I don't hate this decision as much as others, especially when you consider Cochran's poor position within Savai'i. Had Cochran remained loyal to his original group, he's likely one of the first people voted out when they take control of the game. My real concern with Cochran's flip is actually the social backlash. Through that move, Cochran burns bridges with players like Jim, Keith, Whitney, and Ozzie. I doubt that any one of them would vote for Cochran in a final tribal council. It's also important to note that Cochran's flip was largely unsuccessful as he moved from the bottom of one group to the bottom of another. He's voted out at Final 7 once there are no more original Savai'i remaining. It's a bad look for Cochran in that he could not convince anyone to take him to the end despite his obvious negative reputation. If Cochran walked away from Survivor after South Pacific, he's easily outside the top 100 players of all time. Then in Survivor Caramoan, Cochran's game takes a complete 180 as he pulls off the second perfect game in Survivor history. This time, Cochran was adored by the other castaways. This perception meant that Cochran was always safe within the game, and he likely defeats any other player in a final tribal. Strategically, Cochran remains in control for the second half of the season alongside Dawn. Throughout that stretch, Cochran convinces Dawn to follow votes that destroy her reputation with the jury. The clearest example is the Brenda blindside at the final 6, which results in Brenda literally bullying Dawn in the final tribal. Cochran's navigation through the post-merge of Caramoan gives me a lot of confidence in his ability to identify the optimal strategic move and direct the vote accordingly. The common criticism of Cochran's win is that he walked into that season with a wide range of pre-game alliances. That is a factor worth considering in my evaluation, but I feel that every returning player season includes some degree of pre-gaming. At the end of the day, the other contestants on Caramoan were not obligated to follow their pre-game commitments, so I don't take this criticism too seriously. All in all, I feel that the modern landscape of Survivor favors a player like Cochran way more than the franchise in its mid-20s. In Cochran's first appearance, he was placed on a tribe led by the greatest challenge competitor of all time in Ozzie. As a result, that collection of players saw Cochran as this schemy strategist that never pulled his weight in immunity challenges. If you throw Cochran into a new era season, I think that the cast would have way more respect for his strategic mind. Further, I believe that future seasons of Survivor will continue to lean more towards these superfan archetypes. So as I mentioned at the beginning, I feel that Cochran's Caramoan run is a better representation of his player quality. It ranks him here at 26. At number 25, we have a recent player who has competed on just one season, but I think that he has already solidified himself as one of the best strategic thinkers of all time. It's Jesse Lopez from Survivor 43. I remember watching season 43 back in 2022, and at the time, I was in awe with Jesse's navigation through the game. Prior to Jesse, I thought that the new era of Survivor no longer enabled such a level of strategic dominance. At that point, the common route to victory involved laying low within the majority alliance and peaking at the very end. Jesse remains one of the few new era contestants to maintain control for just about the entire post-merge. Early on, he positions himself at the center of the Vesey tribe alongside Cody. At the merge, that pair flips groups, completely changing the power dynamics of the game. From the final 12 through the final 6, Jesse pulls off a nearly perfect game. In that stretch, Jesse proves that he can play a more cutthroat style, which modern juries generally favor. He knocks out Dwight at Final 12, immediately after Dwight passes Jesse an idol. Then at Final 6, Jesse coordinates the elimination of his number one ally in Cody. In that round, Jesse simultaneously knocks Cody out of the game while flushing Carla's idol. It's easily the most impressive strategic maneuver of the last 6 seasons. Through both the Dwight vote and the Cody vote, we learn that Jesse is the type of contestant that's willing to put his personal feelings aside in order to maximize his winning avenues. There's really no doubt for me that Jesse is the best strategist of the new era, but there are other impressive parts of his game. First, you have Jesse's general self-awareness. Jesse is a solid social player, but he knows that he needs an ally to form connections and carry out his various schemes. His relationship with Cody enables Jesse to control the game, but he's never blindsided by their friendship. He's willing to take out Cody at the opportune time. Second, you need to credit Jesse for his jury prospects. Some may worry that Jesse's aggressive play style can burn bridges, but that was not the case on 43. He was never really perceived as a backstabber. In fact, the jury of 43 loved Jesse, and he easily wins the season, potentially unanimously if he could reach that point. I believe that Jesse's general approach to the game means that he wins a jury vote more often than not when he makes it to the end. With that said, there are some fair criticisms of Jesse's game. The most obvious is the physical side. Jesse does not win a single individual immunity challenge, so I worry that he lacks that ability to really bulldoze his way to the end. Second, I consider Jesse a middle-tier social player. This weakness is really highlighted by the Cody elimination. Jesse does not take out Cody at Final 6 for the sole purpose of earning a stamp on his resume. Jesse votes out Cody because Cody was the better social player. If the two of them went to the final tribal council together, Cody wins the season. As a result, you have this odd dynamic with Jesse where he needs flashy moves to impress a jury, but those same decisions magnify his threat level. So overall, I think Jesse's play style of locking down a number one ally and operating the middle can be applied to any season of Survivor. Straight up, I consider Jesse a better strategist than many players ahead of him on this list, but his struggles in the other elements of the game, namely the physical side, drop him to the number 25 spot. At number 24, we have a contestant who came incredibly close to winning his season. It's Dom Abbate from Survivor Ghost Island. In my opinion, Dom has one of the best non-winning games of all time. Everyone remembers him as the player that lost Ghost Island following an initial tied jury vote. But I feel that this legacy overshadows just how dominant of a figure Dom was in navigating his way to the end. He holds complete control over the direction of votes alongside Wendell. While those contestants functioned as a pair, I find that Dom is generally the player calling the shots and getting his way. In the post-swap, Dom is able to throw the immunity challenge to knock out Bradley, who was a threat to him in the long run. At the merge, Dom wins the battle against Chris Noble, taking him out of the game with an idol in his pocket. Then at Final 6, Dom pushes the vote onto Sebastian by presenting a fake idol. I also need to credit Dom for his outlook on the endgame. Dom knew that Wendell was a jury threat, and he was prepared to flip against Wendell, but this plan was essentially disrupted by Wendell having immunity. Wendell wins the immunity challenge at Final 6 and Final 5. When Dom wins immunity at Final 4, he makes the correct decision to throw Wendell into fire-making. If Wendell loses to Angela in that challenge, Dom easily wins the season against Angela and Laurel. In fact, I think there's an argument that Dom beats most of his competitors in a jury vote outside of Wendell. Last major component with Dom's game is his ability to establish meaningful alliances. Obviously, he has the connection to Wendell, who passes up the opportunity to flip against Dom on multiple occasions, the most notable being the Final 6. In addition, Dom originally locks down the alliance with Donathan and Laurel that runs the second half of the game, but I generally give Wendell a bit more credit for maintaining that alliance over the course of the season. As for the negatives with Dom, I think it's fair to compare him to the other one-time players, 5 of which rank ahead of him on this list. There is a social component missing in Dom's game where some of his strategic maneuvers actively sour his relationships with members of the jury. His fake idol play at Final 6 was generally perceived as flashy and cocky. Dom walks into the final tribal council of that season with 5 out of 10 locked jury votes, and he's unable to pull a single Wendell vote onto his side. We also need to acknowledge the fact that many of the votes that Dom loses in the end came from members of his alliance, like Donathan, Laurel, and Sebastian. It seems that Wendell took the time to nurture those relationships, while Dom's hyper-aggressive strategic playstyle impressed those contestants outside the majority. We also see on Ghost Island that Dom has a tendency to enter unnecessary rivalries that make him a potential target. There's the Dom-Chris Noble battle in the early merge, which is not a particularly great look for him. In addition to those social flaws, Dom has competed on just one season, so there is simply less information on his range of outcomes. I've said this in the past on our TikTok page, but if I was on the jury of Season 36, I would have voted for Dom. And if Dom won Ghost Island, I think he ranks higher on my list than where I eventually put Wendell. But for now, he's here at 24. Here at number 23, we have what I expect to be the most controversial placement on this list. After all, many people consider this person the greatest Survivor contestant of all time due to her accolades. It's the two-time winner, Sandra Diaz-Twine. I've said this throughout the entire list, but I generally do not value player placement as much as other people in these rankings. I totally understand that some people would rank Tony and Sandra as the top two players of all time, as they're the only two-time winners. To me, though, ranking Survivor players primarily based on placement feels reductive. I think that the route to the end and the characteristics presented along the way are generally a better indication of player quality. Now, when discussing Sandra's Survivor career, I need to start by crediting her as one of the best players of all time in terms of threat level management. Sandra knows how to operate on the periphery of a majority alliance without coming forward as a legitimate target. In both her winning seasons, Sandra is taken to the final tribal council, which I find really impressive. On Pearl Islands, Lil takes Sandra to the end over Fairplay, who had burned multiple bridges that season. Granted, I think Lil's decision there was based more out of a hatred for Fairplay rather than a connection to Sandra, but that's beside the point. Then on Heroes vs. Villains, Sandra reaches the final four as the biggest jury threat, and Russell takes her to the end. Sandra also excels in forming relationships with members of the jury. She earned 6 out of 7 jury votes on Pearl Islands, then 6 out of 9 on Heroes vs. Villains. These characteristics, combined with her 2 wins, launched Sandra into my top 25 players. But there's components of her playstyle that I have major issues with. First, you have the entire physical side of the game. Sandra is a horrible challenge competitor. She never won an individual immunity across 4 seasons. The cast of season 40 literally calls the sit-out bench the Sandra bench. She's the type of player that's always at risk of going home in the pre-merge due to challenge strength. In fact, Sandra was the original target of her Drake tribe on Pearl Islands. It's been reported after the show that if they lost the first immunity challenge, Sandra is the first boot of the season. This also means that Sandra is incapable of winning out to reach the final tribal council. She simply has less avenues to the end. Second, I don't think that Sandra is a particularly great strategic player. Across her 4 runs, Sandra has proven that she's unable to identify her winning combinations. In Pearl Island, Sandra defeats Lil in the final tribal council, but she attempts to flip the vote onto Lil at the final 6. In Heroes vs. Villains, Sandra constantly attempts and fails to flip the vote onto Russell, who later receives 0 jury votes. Had Sandra succeeded in her plan, then she likely gives the numbers advantage to the heroes, and her path to the end is considerably more difficult. This is not a knock against Sandra's under-the-radar playstyle. If Sandra played passively with an understanding that she could defeat contestants like Russell and Lil, then that is a legitimate route to victory. That is not the case though with Sandra, and she effectively wins her seasons by failing in her strategic misreads. On the topic of Sandra's strategic game, I will say that in making this list, I generally favor those players that can excel from either the top or the bottom. I don't believe that Sandra functions well in a head strategist position. Typically, when she takes a lead strategic role, she makes moves that are detrimental to her own winning potential. She gives an idol to Denise in Season 40. In Survivor Game Changers, she targets the other big threats like Tony and JT, who were potential shields for her. There's the final 8 vote in Pearl Islands, where she casts a vote against Fairplay for seemingly personal reasons. Now, there are some standout maneuvers on Sandra's strategic resume, the biggest being the Burton vote at the final 5 of Pearl Islands. I will admit, though, that there's a bit of favorable revisionist history with Sandra's strategic game. For example, Sandra is oftentimes credited for the coach vote in the pre-merge of Heroes vs. Villains, where she plays on Russell's paranoia in order to make him flip against his allies. In reality, though, Russell was working to maintain this perception of an all-women's alliance, and eliminating Coach was essential to that plan. Long story short, Sandra was not instrumental to the Coach elimination. Third, I mentioned earlier that Sandra's primary survivor strength is the social side, but I find that many people will overrate her social prowess due to the 2 wins. On Pearl Island, she enters multiple feuds with Fairplay, who only votes for her in the end because she's sitting next to Lil. On Heroes vs. Villains, Sandra receives the necessary jury votes to win, but many of those votes were more so anti-Parvati Russell rather than pro-Sandra. The only pro-Sandra votes that you can point to are Rupert and Courtney. Now, you could credit Sandra for positioning herself with poor social players in the end, but as mentioned earlier, Sandra attempted to flip on that group. So overall, when I evaluate Sandra as a player, I need to go back to the primary question of this list. When I'm honest, I don't have a ton of confidence in Sandra winning any random season of Survivor. I think if you ran 100 seasons of the show, Sandra doesn't win that many, especially if it's in front of a modern jury. Now, the 2 wins still matter. In fact, without the second victory, Sandra may not make the top 50 at all. I still consider Sandra one of the most iconic players of all time, but not a top 20 player in the history of the game. Here at number 22, we have a contestant that I see as an improved version of the Sandra archetype, and that's Denise Stapley from Survivor Philippines and Survivor Winners at War. Denise is your ideal Survivor therapist in that she is capable of connecting with a wide range of characters. Those relationships enabled Denise to make deep runs on both of her appearances, winning season 25 and placing 6th on season 40. I look at Denise as one of the best social players of all time. She holds the unique distinction of winning a season of Survivor after attending every possible tribal council. This is particularly impressive when factoring in Denise's archetype. When you review the history of the show, you will find that older women are typically targeted in the pre-merge when their tribes struggle in challenges. Denise's Mat-Sing tribe on Philippines loses every possible immunity challenge, yet there is not a single vote casted against her. In fact, when just 3 Mat-Sing players remain, Denise is positioned in the middle. Denise showcases her social adaptability during the tribe swap of Philippines. After 4 episodes, Denise is sent to the Calabao tribe by herself, where she integrates within the majority and survives 2 tribal councils. Denise's bonds on the island later materialize in jury votes, as she earned 6 out of 8 votes on Philippines. To be fair, it's important to recognize that Denise was not the biggest jury threat on the board. I still believe that Malcolm would have defeated her in a final tribal council, which Denise herself admits. Onto the physical side, Denise is an above-average challenge competitor, winning 3 individual immunities in her Survivor career. She is the type of contestant that I think is capable of bulldozing her way to the final tribal through challenge wins. On Winners at War, it looked like the physical conditions had a serious toll on Denise by the end, but she was the oldest person on that cast, and I think a prime Philippines version of Denise does not experience the same struggles. From a strategic perspective, I feel that Denise is great at following the Sandra blueprint and operating on the periphery of a majority alliance. The strategic factor that elevates Denise over Sandra is her ability to step up and coordinate a vote when necessary. She knocks out Malcolm at Final 4 of Philippines, essentially ensuring her win. She's got the Queenslayer Tribal Council in the pre-merge of Winners at War, which highlighted a cutthroat element of her game. However, I think that Denise's primary weakness in Survivor comes in the strategic arena. Denise is not super active in carving her path to the end on Philippines. There are multiple tribal councils where Denise fails in her various schemes, like the RC boot at the merge and the Jeff Kent blindside at the final 10. In fact, the 4-person alliance that runs the endgame of that season was not established by Denise herself. This passive strategic approach returns in the post-merge of season 40. There, Denise coasts within the majority, but she fails to really build a resume for the jury. By the time Denise goes home at Final 6, I don't know if there was a winning combination for her. Maybe she wins against Michele and Ben, but even that feels iffy. I'll also say that Denise's outlook on the final tribal council draws some concern for me. In Philippines, Denise intended to go to the end of the game with Malcolm, where she would have lost. Denise only flips on Malcolm at Final 4 due to his hesitancy in accepting a final 3 deal. I see that round more as a mistake by Malcolm rather than an accomplishment by Denise. So I feel that Denise is a player that goes far on most seasons. I don't know if she can consistently build a winning resume, but her status as one of the best social players of all time elevates her to the number 22 spot. At number 21, we have a contestant whose legacy is heavily intertwined with Denise, and that's Malcolm Freberg from Survivor Philippines, Caramoan, and Game Changers. With ranking Malcolm ahead of Denise, we have a similar situation to the Carson and Yam-Yam placements earlier on this list. I understand that Denise defeated Malcolm in her first appearance, but I believe that if you ran 100 seasons of Survivor, Malcolm wins more often. For me, the first thing that comes to mind with Malcolm is his adaptability. Malcolm is the type of contestant that has proven to excel from both the majority and the minority. On Survivor Philippines, Malcolm's original Matsing tribe loses every immunity challenge. This is a major wrench thrown into his game, but when he swaps over to the Tang Dang tribe, he establishes new connections that pay major dividends in the post-merge. Malcolm forms the relationship with Scoopin and Lisa, who later roll with him and Denise to the Final Four. Malcolm's Philippines game is one where he functions within the majority the entire time, even after losing nearly all of his early potential allies. Then on Survivor Caramoan, Malcolm showcased a completely different skill set, this time surviving outside the majority. He loses control at Final 12, yet he's able to scrape by for a couple rounds while showing some legitimate strategic acumen. At Final 11, he convinces Reynolds to play an idol on him, which is just insane from Reynolds' perspective. At Final 10, Malcolm pulls off the famous Three Amigos Tribal Council, which I feel is sometimes overrated by the Survivor community. He doesn't play that round perfectly in my opinion. However, it's still impressive that Malcolm came up with this idea of showing the idols as a threat at Tribal Council. Malcolm places 8th on Caramoan, but I think this run did a lot to raise my opinion of him as a player. There's not a lot to note with Malcolm's appearance on Survivor Game Changers. I need to respect his ability to overcome others' perceptions of him. He enters that season as one of the biggest threats on the board, yet he's never outside the majority. He gets voted out in episode 3 due to the combined Tribal Council twist, which was just a ridiculous idea. Malcolm goes home there through an idol play as he's taken out by a tribe who never met him. In other words, Malcolm never had the opportunity to even make his case. I really think that this twist robbed us of a legitimate Malcolm run. It's one of the unluckiest eliminations in the history of the show. Now, I have no clue how far Malcolm would have gone on Game Changers, but I feel comfortable predicting that he at least makes the merge given his strengths in the physical side of the game. And that's something that I haven't even mentioned yet. Malcolm is a great challenge competitor, racking up 4 individual immunities in his Survivor career. On one hand, Malcolm's physicality could get him targeted in the early merge, but on the other, I have a lot of confidence in Malcolm winning out to reach the final tribal. He nearly accomplishes this on Philippines. As for the social side of the game, Malcolm is an expert in impressing a jury. I know there's a lot of debate around the potential Malcolm versus Denise final tribal council, which I think is a bit weird considering that Malcolm never wanted to go to the end with Denise, but even if the two faced off, I believe Malcolm wins. Malcolm's flashy playstyle combined with his general positive vibes make him a legitimate jury threat on any season. I have 2 non-winners ahead of Malcolm on this list, so let me explain why I don't have him a bit higher. First, there's Malcolm's decisions in the endgame. I believe that Malcolm is capable of identifying his optimal winning scenarios, but he struggles to actually achieve those results. In the late post-merge of Philippines, Malcolm makes multiple mistakes that essentially cost him the win. At Final 5, Malcolm allows his immunity idol to expire as they vote out Abby Maria, who had 0 chance at winning a jury vote. Malcolm had the opportunity there to take out either a jury threat in Denise or a player actively gunning for him in Lisa. We also need to bring up Malcolm's decision at the Final 4, where Denise offers a Final 3 deal, and Malcolm's hesitancy causes Denise to flip against him. Second, I think Malcolm is the type of player that comes forward as a clear target in the late game. Malcolm wears his resume on his sleeve. He's going to make bold strategic moves, and he's going to win a bunch of immunities. I think that a Malcolm win typically requires winning out, which we see to a degree on Philippines, where he's immune between the final 7 and the final 5. With all that in mind, I consider Malcolm one of the most well-rounded players in the history of Survivor. I think he's a real contender to return on Survivor 50, which would influence his future ranking. I got him ranked here at number 21. Entering the top 20, we have a contestant who I feel is oftentimes overly criticized by the general Survivor community. While my opinion of this player declined over the course of his subsequent seasons, his first appearance remains one of the 10 most dominant games in Survivor history. It's the winner of Survivor Tocantins, JT Thomas. Similar to Cochran, who we discussed earlier on this list, my assessment of JT really boiled down to the question of how much should I knock him for his disastrous runs on Survivor Game Changers, and to a lesser extent Survivor Heroes vs. Villains. If JT competed on Tocantins and never returned to the franchise, you could make the argument that he's a top 10 all-time contestant. So let's start by jumping into that Tocantins run, where JT proves that he can overcome adversity within the game. JT's Jalapao tribe enters the merge of that season down in number 6-3, yet they are able to take control largely due to the social work of JT himself. Many people credit Steven for the strategic decisions of that partnership, and while I generally agree that Steven was the brains behind the operation, JT still optimizes his opportunities to shine in front of the jury. At the final 5, JT intentionally does not contribute to the coach blindside, knowing that coach will respect him for it. That move showcases both an understanding of the direction of the vote, as well as the personal motivations of his competitors. The biggest highlight of JT's Tocantins win remains his interpersonal relationships. The cast of that season adored JT to the point where multiple contestants, like a Brendan, fell on their swords to ensure him the win. JT pulls off the first perfect game in Survivor history, meaning he received 0 votes cast against him, and he received a unanimous jury vote. Keep in mind that JT crushes Steven in the final tribal in a spot where Steven was the biggest jury threat on the board. Steven likely defeats any other player in the end, yet even he could not squeak out a single winning vote against JT. JT's Tocantins game also presents him as a high-quality physical competitor, as he wins 3 out of 8 individual immunities. With all that said, there are still some flaws in that first appearance which allude to JT's struggles in future seasons. I question JT's selection of alliances. En route to the end, JT knocks out multiple contestants who were willing to work with him for the long run, like Coach and Brendan. He instead rides with Steven and Aaron to the final 3, where if he lost individual immunity, he gets voted out. There's an argument there that JT operates as an overly loyal ally following the wishes that place Steven in the power seat. In fact, when JT wins final immunity, he elects to take Steven to the final tribal council over Aaron, who was despised by the jury. Granted, it doesn't make a massive difference as JT beats either one of them in a jury vote, but it's a clear example of him acting with his heart over his mind. Then we jump over to Survivor Heroes vs. Villains, which people often use to discredit JT's legacy. Obviously, his second appearance did not end well, but I feel that this run is largely overhated. Once again, JT proves that he can establish himself within the center of a tribal power structure, even after initially finding himself on the outside. At the merge, you have the infamous decision from JT to pass Russell and Idol, which blows up in his face and leads to his elimination, but I understand the strategic thought process behind it. No one on that cast watched Russell's original season, as it was filmed right before season 20, meaning none of the players fully understood the extent of his villainous gameplay. The primary motivation behind that move was the suspicion of an all-women's alliance on the villain's tribe, which makes sense given Parvati's history on the show. The past idol is still a knock against JT's resume as a hyper-aggressive strategic move, but I will note that if it worked out in his favor and the heroes took control of the numbers at the merge, JT was well positioned to make a deep run on that season. If he could reach the end, I believe that he defeats most of the other heroes in a jury vote. After heroes versus villains, I would likely rank JT just outside the top 10, but his Game Changers appearance is what really drops him down to number 20. That game is a complete disaster from a strategic perspective. He leaks his group's plan at the combined tribal council, causing him to lose Malcolm as an ally. Following that vote, JT was clearly positioned on the bottom of his tribe, and he gets voted out in the next round with an idol in his pocket. He was simply unable to correctly identify his poor positioning. So all in all, I actually considered dropping JT further on the list, but that Tocantins win alone was enough to earn him the number 20 spot. At number 19, we have a contestant that competed against JT in 2 of his 4 appearances. This player has a similar resume to JT in that he's got one dominant run that outweighs some other rough games, and that's Tyson Apostol from Survivor Tocantins, Heroes vs. Villains, Blood vs. Water, and Winners at War. I think that Tyson is the perfect example of someone that learned the game of Survivor over the course of his career. That positive trajectory differs from someone like JT, who got worse on his subsequent appearances. Starting in Survivor Tocantins, Tyson demonstrates some baseline skills within the game. He can dominate the physical side, winning 2 out of 3 individual immunities that season. He can navigate into the core of a majority alliance, which we see on the original Tambira tribe. But Tyson mismanages his threat level, and by the final 8, others perceive him as a legitimate contender, causing Sierra and Aaron to flip over and knock him out of the game. In addition, Tyson seemingly doesn't care about some of his relationships that season, as he ridicules Sierra in the post-merge, effectively burning that jury vote. The Tocantins edition of Tyson was a below-average player, and the Heroes vs. Villains version was even worse. There, Tyson initially finds his way into the majority, serving as the second-in-command to Boston Rob, but then you get the second Villains Tribal Council, where Tyson essentially takes himself out of the game by flipping his vote onto Parvati at the last second. It's one of the worst strategic decisions made by any winner in Survivor history, and it honestly made me consider dropping Tyson outside the top 20. Tyson's entire Survivor legacy flips in his 3rd appearance on Survivor Blood vs. Water. There, Tyson pulls off an extremely dominant game, as he's positioned in the core of the majority alliance for the entire season. Outside of the Rock Draw Tribal Council, every plan that Tyson concocts comes to fruition. He achieves his ideal Final 3 scenario against Jervis and Monica, where he wins in a 7-1-0 jury vote. Blood vs. Water showcased the best side of Tyson, one where he can intentionally carve his own path to a win. Although Season 27 was his best performance, I still noted some minor red flags. I think Tyson's social game was suboptimal, which limited his jury prospects. For example, he tells Katie at Tribal Council that there was a spot on the jury waiting for her. While Tyson wins against Jervis and Monica, I think that he loses in most other combinations. He loses to Tina, who places 4th, Sierra, who places 5th, or Hayden, who places 6th. I'll admit that based on Tyson's 4 runs, I think that he's an average social player. I believe that many contestants ahead of Tyson on this list win more often when they sit at the final Tribal Council. Another knock against his game is the Rock Draw Tribal, where Tyson willingly enters a rock draw with an idol in his pocket. The conversation at Tribal Council before the vote should have led Tyson to play his idol, but he held on to it instead. Keep in mind that 3 contestants drew rocks there, so if Tyson picks the miscolored rock, which was a legitimate possibility, he goes home and he doesn't make this list at all. I didn't take too much away from Tyson's Winners at War appearance. He gets lumped into that group of old school contestants knocked out in the early game, but even on that run, Tyson reaffirmed his challenge prowess, winning the Edge of Extinction challenge. So when I look at Tyson's Survivor career, there's definitely some low points, but you can see the core characteristics. He's an average social player, but he's elite in the physical and strategic realms. It ranks him here at number 19. At number 18, we're keeping with the middle school era of the show. We have who I believe is the second best non-winner of all time, and that's Amanda Kimmel from Survivor China, Micronesia, and Heroes vs. Villains. The surface level draw with Amanda is the fact that she is the first player in Survivor history to reach the final tribal council twice. While that's an impressive accomplishment, I think that it actually undersells Amanda's game ability. Across all 3 appearances, Amanda builds a stable alliance around her that at least reaches the merge. In Survivor China, she co-dominates the direction of the vote alongside Todd Herzog. She votes correctly in every tribal council without coming forward as a legitimate target. Todd, by contrast, mismanages his threat level, making him the constant target of the minority for the back section of the game. En route to the end, Amanda leads multiple key votes like the Sharia vote at the final 11 and the famous James blindside at the final 7, where they knock him out with 2 idols in his pocket. In Survivor Micronesia, Amanda is a central figure of the Black Widow Brigade, which runs the post-merge. While I generally credit Cirie and Parvati more for the strategic decisions of that alliance, Amanda still played a valuable role within that group. Once again on that season, Amanda votes correctly in every tribal council, with the exception of the Aussie boot, which Amanda reportedly knew about beforehand. Then on Survivor Heroes vs. Villains, Amanda positions herself at the center of the Heroes Alliance. Had JT's past idol play worked out at the merge and the Heroes took the numbers advantage, Amanda would have been in a prime spot to make a deep run. I look at Amanda as one of the most consistent players in Survivor history, partially due to her ability to navigate into the majority, but also due to her physicality. Across her 3 seasons, Amanda won 4 individual immunities, which is the second most by any woman. Amanda is the type of contestant that can win out, which we see on both China and Micronesia, as she wins the last 2 immunities of both of those seasons. Socially, I think Amanda is solid. I feel that she generally gravitates towards a crowd in her age demographic. Amanda is not particularly adored by the people outside her alliance, but she knows how to form strong bonds within her group. In China, I believe that both Courtney and Todd were determined to go to the end with Amanda. That in Micronesia, Amanda locks down a number 1 ally in Parvati, who was completely loyal to her. As for the negatives with Amanda, the flaw that most people point out is her ability to perform in a final tribal council. Amanda struggles to really take ownership of her game in the end of both China and Micronesia. It's a fair criticism that would limit Amanda's jury prospects on any given season. However, I think we need to at least acknowledge the fact that Amanda competed in China and Micronesia back to back. She never had the opportunity to learn from her mistakes. Amanda's outlook on the final tribal also worries me to a degree. On Survivor China, Amanda elects to go to the final tribal with Todd, who beats her. What's even worse is the fact that Amanda potentially loses the game even if she votes out Todd at Final 4. In the hypothetical Denise, Courtney, Amanda final tribal, it's a toss-up between Courtney and Amanda. Then on Survivor Micronesia, Amanda reaches the final 3 in a spot where she likely loses to either Cirie or Parvati in a final tribal council. This is to say that I know Amanda can carve her path to the end, but I think she struggles to select the best avenue. Last knock against Amanda is her tendency to play a bit in the shadows. In both of her dominant runs, Amanda works alongside an ally that stands in the spotlight. Amanda refuses to ever flip on her number 1 allies in Todd and Parvati, so there may be a limit to Amanda's cutthroat playstyle. So there's some clear blemishes on Amanda's Survivor resume, but that is the case with just about every non-winner in the history of the show. Most of the remaining players on my list have won the game and proven themselves as a jury threat. Amanda ranking in the top 20 without a win is still very impressive in my eyes. I have her here at number 18. At number 17, we have a player that co-dominated his original season en route to a win. I ranked this contestant's running mate earlier on this list at 24, so here we have Wendell Holland. My primary reason for ranking Wendell so high is his Ghost Island game, which I reflect back on as an upper middle tier win. For the majority of that season, Wendell sits in the power seat alongside his ally Dom. From the final 12 onwards, Wendell and Dom are in control. The common question that comes with any iconic Survivor duo is who deserves more credit for their navigation through the game. Obviously, I think very highly of both Dom and Wendell, but if I had to choose, I think that Dom is the better strategic player. Dom was generally the one out in front directing the vote, especially at points like the final 6 with the Sebastian boot. That doesn't mean that Wendell is poor in the strategic realm. In fact, I consider him one of the better strategic minds on this list. Wendell knew early in that season that others would perceive him as a threat due to his physicality and his strong positioning. With that understanding, Wendell intentionally aligned with Dom, who could serve as a shield. The main strength of Wendell is the social side. Wendell knows how to connect with others on an individual level, which results in legitimate allies. He keeps people like Donathan and Laurel loyal to him at multiple spots in the post-merge where they should have flipped. He makes conscious efforts to build trust with them through tangible moves. At the final 5, Wendell placed his immunity idol on Laurel, and Laurel later cast the winning vote of the season for him. It's no coincidence that all 6 of Wendell's winning jury votes on Ghost Island came from players within his alliance, as Wendell took the time to develop those relationships. Wendell's social prowess is my primary reason for ranking him so high on the list. I think he's the type of player that wins a jury vote even when he boasts an inferior strategic resume. Wendell's Ghost Island appearance also showcased his challenge ability, as he wins 2 out of 10 individual immunities. I believe that Wendell can win out on any given season. There are some holes in Wendell's Survivor resume which are worth noting. First, I think Wendell can play a bit too loyal. As far as the Ghost Island edit shows us, Dom was willing to flip on Wendell before Wendell was willing to flip on Dom. Wendell had the opportunity to take the shot at Dom at the final 6, and he passed it up. Now, I think Wendell still recognized Dom as a threat in that he would have thrown him into fire-making at final 4, but we have no evidence of Wendell ever cutting his number 1 ally. He rides with Dom to the end of Ghost Island, and he never flips against either Nick or Jeremy in Winners at War. Second, while I praised Wendell's social game in Ghost Island, I think that his Winners at War appearance offers some conflicting information. There, Wendell actively burns his relationship with people like Parvati and Michele. At Final 13, Wendell blatantly states at Tribal Council that he's willing to change his alliances in exchange for fire tokens. At the end of the day, I still consider Wendell one of the greatest players of all time. I stand by my take that I would have voted for Dom over Wendell in Ghost Island, but if you threw both of them into a simulator and they each competed on 100 seasons of Survivor, I think that Wendell racks up more wins due to his social game. He ranks here at number 17. At number 16, we have the highest rated new era contestant on this list. It's Dee Valladares from Survivor 45. We covered every episode of Survivor 45 on the Survivor Analytics podcast, and as that season progressed, my opinion of Dee continued to rise. I don't think that Dee is necessarily a master in one component of Survivor. In comparing her to other new era contestants, I believe that Jessie can coordinate higher difficulty strategic maneuvers, while Jam Jam can develop deeper relationships. Rather, it's the entire package with Dee that cements her as an all-time great. There isn't a glaring weakness on her resume. She wins 3 out of 8 individual immunity challenges on season 45. I doubt that Dee ever goes home in the pre-merge over 100 seasons. Socially, Dee has proven that she can form trusting alliances with players who later want to take her to the final tribal council. Survivor 45 was dominated by the Reba 4 alliance, and Dee positioned herself in the middle of that group. By the time Dee reaches the final 6, she had 3 other players in Austin, Julie, and Drew that all agreed to bring her to the end. Dee's relationship with Austin was particularly impressive. She knocks out his second closest ally in Drew at the final 6, yet Austin remains loyal to Dee at the final 5. Dee's strong relationships also help her avoid the target despite her serving as the head strategic thinker of the majority. Other than the final 5 vote, which we'll touch on later, Dee is safe in every tribal council. There are just 2 votes casted against her that entire season. What distinguishes Dee from other great social players is her ability to connect with people outside her core alliance. En route to victory, Dee establishes bonds with players outside the Reba 4, such as Katurah and Kelley, both of which vote for Dee in the final tribal council. Then we get to the strategic side of the game. Dee knows how to build a majority alliance where she holds substantial agency. Of the 8 post-merge votes on her season, you can credit Dee as the head strategic thinker for half of them. She coordinates the eliminations of Caleb, Kendra, Emily, and Drew. Amidst those votes, Dee proves herself as an innovative strategic thinker. For example, at the final 7, the other players conspire to knock out one of Dee's closest allies in Julie. Dee responds by leaking the plan to Julie, who held an idol. She then votes with the majority against Julie in order to keep their relationship a secret. Through that move, Dee locked down Julie's trust and kept her strategic options open going into the final 6. Meanwhile, Dee's work in the Drew blind side at the final 6 shows a cutthroat side to her game. Dee combines this strategic acumen with a strong understanding of the jury. After winning the final immunity challenge, Dee makes the correct read in taking Austin to the final tribal council, effectively blocking his chance to flash in front of the jury with a fire-making challenge win. A hyper-aggressive player would have attempted to knock out Austin at final 4, but Dee knew that she already had the votes in place to beat him. I really wanted to place Dee higher on this list because she's so well-rounded, but there's a couple factors that hold her back. Threat level management is a concern for me. Dee nearly goes home at the final 5, if not for a paranoid vote by Katurah, and she's positioned at the final 4 such that every remaining player intended to put her into the fire-making challenge. I also found Dee's final tribal council performance pretty uninspiring. Dee enters the final tribal against Jake and Austin, where I believe she held a far superior resume, yet she only earns 5 out of 8 jury votes. I think there's a world where Dee makes an impressive run to the end and loses the season due to her presentation. Another common criticism with Dee is her excessive loyalty to some of her allies. I credited Dee earlier for the cutthroat move of voting out Drew, but Drew was her weakest connection within the Reba 4. Dee never takes the shot at either Julie or Austin. Now, you can definitely argue that Dee never needed to vote them out due to her jury chances, but I'd still like to see that side to her game. Last knock against Dee is the sample size. I find Dee's dominance through 45 very impressive, but we've never seen her operate outside the majority. I don't know how Dee recovers when the numbers are not on her side. So I know that some people will claim that ranking Dee this high is recency bias, but I really believe that her legacy will continue to bolster as we move away from Survivor 45. In my mind, she's undoubtedly the best player of the new era. She ranks here at number 16. At number 15, we have one of my favorite characters in Survivor history. This is someone that I had ranked as high as number 11 in previous editions of this list, but I later decided to drop him down a couple spots, and that's Todd Herzog, the winner of Survivor China. Admittedly, I am a massive Todd Herzog fan. He was already one of my favorite winners of Survivor, and having him guest star on our podcast a while back was an absolute dream come true. Personal bias aside, I think that Todd's run on China is one of the most dominant strategic performances in the history of the show. For the entirety of that season, Todd is positioned in the majority, directing votes alongside Amanda Kimmel. As a superfan, Todd was willing to take a more cutthroat strategic approach. For example, in the pre-merge, Leslie shares a clue to the immunity idol with Todd, and Todd was still willing to vote her out, such that he was the only remaining contestant with knowledge of the idol. Later on, at the final 7, Todd participates in the James blind side, knocking him out of the game with 2 idols in his pocket. I also consider Todd a very innovative strategic thinker. You can tell in watching Survivor China that Todd was just on another level in terms of his outlook on the game. In the early game, Todd aligns with Aaron knowing that he could present Aaron as the figurehead. This concept of aligning with shields was way ahead of his time. Later on in the pre-merge, Todd comes up with the scheme to pass James an immunity idol in order to ensure that the Fei Long Alliance enters the merge with the numbers advantage. Now, that plan backfires as James goes into the merge with 2 idols, but it was a move that I don't see many players willing to attempt back in 2007. Many people remember Todd for his strategic stranglehold on China, but I think he's very underrated socially. Todd proves that he can build trusting bonds within his primary alliance. Starting at the final 6, Todd is perceived as the biggest threat in the game. For 3 straight episodes, the players on the bottom target Todd, yet his core alliance of Courtney, Amanda, and Denise remain completely loyal to him. This social ability culminates at the Final Four, where Todd convinces Amanda to take him to the final tribal over Denise. I look at Amanda as one of the best non-winners of Survivor, so it's very impressive that Todd was able to trick her into knocking out Denise when, in reality, Amanda likely defeats Denise in the end. It's clear that Todd can form legitimate relationships within his main alliance, but can he connect with the players outside his group? The answer is yes. In the pre-merge, Todd's relationships with people outside his alliance enable him to receive clues to the immunity idol. He receives clues from both Dave and Leslie. The best aspect of Todd as a Survivor player goes without saying, it's his ability to perform in a Final Tribal Council. Todd delivers, in my opinion, the greatest Final Tribal Council speech in the history of Survivor. He makes a clear distinction between his manipulative gameplay and his personal relationships on the island. He understands how to cater responses to individual jury members, which we see with his response to Jean Robert. That capacity to clearly explain his game and connect with the jury gives me a lot of confidence in Todd's winning equity on any season. The challenge for Todd is not impressing the jury, it's simply reaching the end. With all that said, Todd is not a perfect Survivor player. There's multiple reasons why 14 people rank ahead of him. First, Todd struggles in the physical aspect of Survivor. He doesn't win an individual immunity on China, and I think that he greatly benefits from competing on the dominant Fei Long tribe. Fei Long attends just 2 tribal councils in the pre-merge. I worry that Todd comes forward as a potential target when his tribe struggles in challenges and people look to pick off the weaker physical players. I also think that Todd mismanages his threat level in the late game. While it's impressive that Todd kept his core alliance loyal, I believe that the all-time greats of Survivor avoid the target in its entirety. It's important to note that if Denise wins immunity at Final Four, Todd is in serious danger. Todd also suffers from the small sample size. We've only seen one side of his game where he dominates from the majority with little resistance. I don't know how Todd functions without the numbers. So like I said at the beginning of this ranking, Todd is one of my all-time favorite players of Survivor. I feel that this ranking puts him at his ceiling given the amount of information. He's here at 15. Moving ahead to number 14, we got our third consecutive one-time player in Chris Doherty, the winner of Survivor Vanuatu. Vanuatu is an underappreciated season, so I feel that Chris oftentimes doesn't get the respect that he deserves as an elite Survivor contestant. In his one season, we see Chris excel from both the top and the bottom. I'm confident that Chris can go far on any given season, regardless of his positioning. For the first half of Vanuatu, Chris serves as the head strategist of the majority. He's in control of the original Lepevi tribe with the Fat Five Alliance. At the tribe swap, Chris works from the power seat as he establishes new connections with the likes of Twyla, Scout, and Julie. The second half of the game is a different story. Chris loses the numbers at the merge, and he's on the bottom for 3 straight rounds as all of his allies are picked off. Now, I think Chris deserves some criticism for losing control in the first place. He clearly brought the wrong people into that round. However, I also think it's impressive that Chris was able to avoid the target during that stretch. While on the bottom, Chris still plays actively by deepening his connections to players like Twyla and Scout, who elect to flip the game with him at the Final 7. That Final 7 round alone skyrocketed Chris in my rankings. He proved that he could gather his footing in the game when his back was against the wall. Outside Chris's strategic versatility, I think that he's shown himself as an incredible social player, someone capable of building relationships and pulling people into his schemes. I mentioned the Final 7 earlier, which can largely be attributed to Chris's amiable nature. Through that flip, Chris pulls 2 enemies together in Eliza and Twyla. He was the glue of that new majority that controlled the game for the next 3 rounds. The Final 3 is another impressive social maneuver by Chris, where he locks down a Final 2 deal with Twyla. That deal separated the pair of Scout and Twyla, who had worked together for most of that season, and it ensured that Chris would win the season as long as Scout did not win final immunity. On the topic of Chris's social game, we need to highlight his ability to conduct himself in front of a jury. In his run to the end, Chris lies a lot. leaving many jury members feeling initially bitter. Chris walked into that final tribal of Vanuatu on the hot seat, and he responds with an apologetic approach that sways the jury back over to his side. I see Chris as one of the best final tribal council performers in the history of the show. I have a lot of confidence in him winning a jury vote whenever he reaches that point. Physically, Chris is solid. He wins 3 out of 8 individual immunities in the post-merge, but the quality of competition was not particularly great. I just spent a couple minutes raving about Chris, so why don't I rank him higher? Just like Todd and Dee before him, there's a smaller sample size with Chris. Now, his single appearance showcases an ability to succeed in a wider range of positions, which we don't get from either Dee or Todd. Still, just about every contestant ranked ahead of Chris has competed at least twice. Another knock against Chris is his decision-making from the top, as he puts himself in a position to lose the numbers at the merge. I'd also say that Chris's peak on Survivor was not as dominant as many of the winners ahead of him due to his endgame positioning. Chris was positioned at the final 3, with Scout, who intended on taking Twyla to the final tribal. Scout winning final immunity was highly unlikely, but now that we're towards the top of the list, we will see some winners who have the season locked before the final tribal, meaning they beat anyone left in the game and every other player wants to take them to the end. So even though Chris's Survivor legacy has not stood the test of time, I look back on him as a legend of the show. He ranks here at number 14. At number 13, we have a player who I ranked as fringe top 10 after her first appearance on the show. Her second run actually worked to reduce my opinion of her player quality, and that's Natalie Anderson. I consider Natalie's win on San Juan del Sur one of the 10 most dominant performances in the history of the show. While there's a couple low points, namely the Jeremy boot at Final 10, Natalie showcases a lot of game ability across that season. She understands timing within Survivor better than just about any other player. At Final 10, her primary alliance flips against her in the Jeremy boot, but Natalie resisted the urge to immediately turn on them. She gains trust with the alliance's head in John by convincing him to successfully play his idol at the Final 9, and through that move, Natalie reintegrates into the core of the majority, which enables her to dismantle that power structure from the inside. She later completes her revenge arc by voting out John at Final 6 with an idol in his pocket. En route to victory, Natalie comes forward as a player willing to take strategic risks in the game. At Final 7, she knocks out Alec, then convinces her alliance that she did so by accident. That move preserved Keith, who trusted Natalie and acted as a valuable shield for her. Then at Final 5, Natalie pulls off arguably the greatest idol play in the history of the show. In that round, Natalie successfully plays her idol on Jacqueline in a spot where Keith held individual immunity. There were just 3 contestants, including Natalie, vulnerable in that tribal council, but Natalie was so well insulated socially that she didn't receive a single vote cast against her. Her plan works out perfectly as Baylor goes home and Natalie reaches the Final 4, where every remaining contestant wants to ride with her to the end. On the social side, I think people often underrate Natalie's connections on Season 29. Keep in mind that Survivor San Juan del Sur was a blood versus water themed season, where Natalie's loved one, Nadia, is voted out in the premiere. Every other player on that cast had a locked ally on the island. That was not the case for Natalie, yet she still navigated her way to the final tribal council. I would also note that Natalie was adored by the season's jury. By the Final 5, I think she defeats any remaining player in a jury vote. Natalie ends up winning the season in a 5-2 to 1 vote, but that tally still underestimates her social game. 2 of the votes that Natalie lost came from jury members whose loved ones sat at the final tribal council, so she had no shot at getting those. It's also worth mentioning that Reed intended on voting for Natalie, but he was so confident that she would win the season that he flips his vote to Jacqueline to ensure that Missy gets 3rd place. Walking away from San Juan del Sur, I would have ranked Natalie somewhere in the 8 through 11 range on this list. But then we get to Winners at War, which I believe reveals many flaws that were not evident in Natalie's first appearance. To be clear, this bump down in the ranking does not derive from the fact that Natalie was voted out in the first episode. After all, Natalie was positioned on a tribe with Jeremy Collins. The 2 of them had a long history of working together, so there was no chance that a cast of all winners would allow both of them to stick around. My primary issues with Natalie's run on season 40 are her decisions after her initial elimination. On the edge of extinction, Natalie reportedly burned bridges with multiple competitors who she knew would later serve on the jury. After earning her spot back in the game, Natalie makes multiple strategic blunders. She openly targets Tony, which enables Tony to adapt his strategy accordingly. She knocks out Ben over Sarah at Final 5 in a spot where Ben was not a real jury threat. By the time Natalie reaches the Final 4, there are no winning combinations for her. I think she loses the season to either Sarah or Tony. When Natalie wins final immunity, she elects to put Sarah and Tony into fire-making. Now, I rarely support the idea of throwing yourself into the fire-making challenge, but I think this was one instance where Natalie needed to take that risk given her insights from the edge of extinction. Natalie knew that Tony was the heavy favorite, yet she willingly passed Sarah the opportunity to shine in front of the jury. In the final tribal council, Natalie earns 4 jury votes, but that second place distinction kind of overshadows many of her missteps along the way. I'm just not as confident in Natalie's social and strategic abilities as I was following season 29. At the end of the day, though, I believe that her success in San Juan del Sur guarantees Natalie a spot in the top 20. I would be shocked if she ever fell out of that range. She ranks here at number 13. At number 12, we have a contestant whose trajectory is the opposite of Natalie. This player likely would have ranked somewhere in the 30s following her winning game. It was actually her non-winning performance on Winners at War that shot her up the list, and that's Sophie Clark. I understand that many people disrespect Sophie's win on South Pacific as she defeated an iconic Survivor character in Coach in the final tribal council. And I will admit that if I sat on the jury of season 23, I would have casted my winning vote for Coach, as I think he was more instrumental to the strategic direction of the season. Regardless on how you feel about Sophie's victory, you need to credit her for her outlook on the endgame. I see Sophie as one of the best long-term strategic thinkers in Survivor history. I think Sophie is incredible at anticipating the actions of her competitors, which is shown by her alliance with Coach. Sophie always intended on rolling with Coach to the final tribal of that season, with an expectation that he would refuse to own up to his deceptive gameplay. That plan worked out to perfection as Coach crumbles in the final tribal and Sophie wins in a 6-3-0 jury vote. In the strategic realm, I also respect Sophie's view on aggressive strategic moves. Sophie knows that a flashy play is not always beneficial or even necessary to win a season of Survivor. Throughout the post-merge of South Pacific, Sophie operates in the core of the majority Upolu alliance, and she works to keep that group intact. For example, at the final 7, Coach receives an offer to flip on Sophie and roll with the group of Albert, Cochran, and Edna, who were all disrespected by the jury. If Coach accepts that deal, he potentially goes on to win the season. However, Sophie's relationship with Coach keeps him loyal when better opportunities come forward. Another major positive of Sophie's South Pacific run is the physical side of the game. She wins 3 out of 10 individual immunities, including the final immunity challenge against literally the best challenge competitor of all time in Ozzy. I feel like people always bring up the fact that Ozzy was 1 immunity challenge away from winning this season, but more people need to acknowledge Sophie as the player who defeated him in his strongest arena. My main concern with Sophie after South Pacific was the social side of the game, as she rubs some contestants the wrong way. Ozzy infamously calls Sophie a brat in the final tribal council. At the time, it seemed that many of Sophie's winning jury votes were more so anti-Coach rather than pro-Sophie. Those concerns in the social arena completely went away through Sophie's performance on Winners at War. Keep in mind that this season was filmed 8 years after Sophie's win. The Sophie we watched in season 40 was the same savvy strategic player, but she was more emotionally mature. Sophie was capable of forming a wider range of alliances, which materialized in her eventually becoming the best socially insulated player at the merge. Through her strong positioning, she leads the Wendell vote at Final 12 and the Tyson vote at Final 10. Even in her elimination round at the final 9, Sophie was technically in the majority as she goes out through a plurality vote. So I know that some people will claim that I rank Sophie too high on the list, but I just have a lot of confidence in her pinpointing her winning scenarios and actively putting herself in those spots. She lands here at number 12. On to number 11, we have a player that we recently covered on the Survivor Analytics podcast, and that's Yul Kwon, the winner of Survivor Cook Islands. Prior to our coverage of that season, I actually ranked Yul a couple spots lower on the list, but a rewatch of Cook Islands reignited that confidence I had in him as a player. My initial reservations with Yul really derive from the fact that there are multiple lucky scenarios that break in his favor and ultimately lead to his win. Given the hand he was dealt, Yul played a dominant game, but those lucky moments are still important to note. You had the bottle twist in the pre-merge, which gave Yul's alliance the opportunity to flip the numbers in their favor. You had Yul's Super Idol, which could be played after the votes are read aloud in every tribal council on the season. Technically, there was not a single tribal council in this game where Yul was vulnerable. On top of all that, you had the surprise Final 3 twist, where if that season operated as a Final 2 as Yul intended, Ozzy likely wins final immunity and Yul potentially goes out in third place. If not for those factors in Yul's winning game, he easily ranks higher on the list, potentially as high as number 7. Outside those lucky points though, Yul's Cook Islands run reveals a truly talented Survivor player. Straight up, Yul is in the conversation for one of the best strategic minds in the history of the show. For the entirety of Cook Islands, Yul functions as this empathetic mob boss, directing the vote from the majority. He votes correctly in every tribal council, while intentionally taking credit for his strategic maneuvers. At the merge, Yul famously flips Penner onto his side by showing him an idol. Given that idols were fairly new to Survivor at this point, it's pretty impressive that Yul was able to identify the power of an idol as a social weapon. After gaining the numbers, Yul flashes that idol during the auction, ensuring that his competitors perceive him as the mastermind of I2. Yul also deeply understood the importance of the jury. At Final 7, he makes the deal with Adam, where Adam guarantees Yul his jury vote, and in return, Yul votes out Penner. That jury vote from Adam later wins Yul the season as he defeats Ozzy and Becky in a 5-4-0 vote. This strategic run also proved that Yul could excel from the bottom and flip the game in his favor. I also want to credit Yul for his social connections on Cook Islands, which I feel people don't acknowledge enough. While it's true that Yul held that super idol all season, at no point did a group of players band together to actually flush it. The Raro contestants attempted and failed in this endeavor at the final 9. Yul's idol stayed in the game due to his relationships, especially within his primary alliance. There are multiple points on this season where the players on the bottom call out Yul as the genius of I2, yet his allies remain completely loyal to him. Becky and Sandra wanted to ride with Yul to the final 3. Meanwhile, I think Ozzy even respected Yul as a competitor, to the point where he would have considered taking him to the end. When Yul reaches the final tribal council, he is so well respected by the jury that he defeats Ozzy, who pulled off the greatest individual challenge performance in the history of the show. This season aired in 2006, a point in time where challenge wins were more significant in the eyes of the jury, yet Yul still won. On the physical side, Yul has never won an individual immunity challenge, but he's still strong in that arena, someone that I don't see going out early due to challenge performance. So while I find Yul's win on Cook Islands very impressive, I think he struggled a bit in terms of threat level management. By the mid-merge of that season, players are literally calling him the leader of the I2s. In fact, the Raros attempted to gather the numbers against him at the final 9, which isn't a particularly great look. I don't think that Yul's dominant approach would really translate to the modern show, where people in his position often become major targets. Yul's Winners at War run was brief but solid. He goes out in the pre-merge under pretty unlucky circumstances as he swapped into a tribe of only his alliance, which forces them to turn on each other. To be fair though, Yul is a bit hyper-aggressive strategically towards the end, which causes his allies to turn against him. So overall, I look at Yul as one of the all-time legendary players of Survivor, and if not for a couple odd circumstances in his winning game, he likely ranks higher on the list. For now though, he ranks here at number 11. We've made it to the top 10, where I think you can categorize these final contestants into a few tiers. This first tier includes 2 players who have only played Survivor once, but they demonstrate significant game ability. So starting at the number 10 spot, we have someone that I feel is largely undervalued by the Survivor community due to the overall negativity and ickiness of his season, and that's Tommy Sheehan, the winner of Survivor Island of the Idols. My primary reason for ranking Tommy so high is his adaptability within the game, as he proves that he can overcome unlucky scenarios. Time and time again on Season 39, Tommy is thrown into poor positions through circumstances completely outside his own control, yet he still comes out as the season's winner. For example, in the split tribal council of that season, Tommy is put into a terrible position where he's by himself in a tribe with 4 members of the opposing Lyro Alliance. Most Survivor contestants go home in that situation, yet Tommy convinces that group to flip on each other. It's true that Missy makes some mistakes in that round, which also contributes to the flip, but you need to credit Tommy for at least lowering his threat level enough to avoid the target. That vote had major implications for the long run of the season, as it gave Tommy's Boehlke Alliance the numbers advantage. Another unlucky scenario occurs at the final 6, where Tommy loses his ally Dan due to an ejection. Now, I completely agree with production's decision to remove Dan from the game, but from a strategic perspective, this was a massive blow to Tommy's long-term outlook. At that point, Tommy had intended on rolling with Dan and Dean to the final tribal council, where he easily would have won the season. When Dan gets pulled, Tommy adapts and brings together a new final 3 with Dean and Nora. Outside those unlucky moments, Tommy operates within the majority for the rest of the season, where he holds substantial agency. He votes correctly in every post-merge tribal council without coming forward as a legitimate target. In fact, by the final 4, every remaining contestant wanted to take him to the end. He convinces Nora to take him to the final 3, which is just absurd. To me, this is the true magic of Tommy Sheehan. Rarely can you find a player with such a level of control and social insulation. Tommy describes himself in the final tribal council as the quintessential social player, and I completely agree. Tommy's social relationships keep him safe for the entire season. Outside that unlucky split tribal, Tommy never has his name written down. Keep in mind that Tommy won a season of Survivor whose theme surrounded idols and advantages. Tommy never acquired a single advantage, yet he still won due to his connections across the cast. That social component of Tommy's game is a major reason why he can excel from both the top or the bottom. The primary argument against Tommy is the Lauren factor. Some people claim that Tommy was dependent on Lauren, and while the two of them worked together all season, I found that Tommy got his way more often than not. Tommy was able to convince Lauren to cut many of her secondary allies in the game, while Tommy preserved his own. By the time they reached the final 6, every other remaining contestant, in Dan, Janet, Nora, and Dean, were all more loyal to Tommy than Lauren. I also see people discrediting Tommy's win by saying that Lauren would have defeated him in a final tribal council, and I don't know if that's true. I've ran this simulation in the past, but in a Nora, Tommy, Lauren final 3, it's a close vote that essentially comes down to the jury votes of Jamal and Aaron. I go back and forth on who wins that scenario, but it's important to mention that Tommy never intended on taking Lauren that far in the game to begin with. If not for the Dan ejection, Tommy knocks out Lauren at final 5. To me, there's only 2 legitimate arguments against Tommy. One of them is the sample size, as we haven't seen him achieve the same level of success over multiple seasons. The other is that potential final tribal against Lauren. Now that we're in the top 10, we are looking at some all-time social contestants who have wins where they defeat literally anyone in the end, and I don't have that same level of confidence in Tommy. Overall, I look at Tommy as one of the most adaptable players in the history of Survivor. He plays well from the top, he plays well from the bottom, and he plays well when you throw twists and advantages into the game that theoretically damage his long-term winning potential. I think he's the second best one-time player of Survivor. He ranks here at number 10. On to number 9, I got the highest rated one-time player on this list in Earl Cole, the winner of Survivor Fiji. Honestly, Earl and Tommy were neck and neck for this spot. I think the main point in favor of Tommy over Earl is the fact that Tommy has proven himself in multiple strategic positions on Survivor. With Earl, we've only seen him operate from the majority, We've never witnessed Earl flip the game in his favor from the bottom, so there's a bit less information as compared to Tommy. At the end of the day, though, I find Earl's winning game on Fiji to be so impressive that it overshadows the lack of intel. At some point down the line, I want to release my full rankings on the best winning games of Survivor, but as it stands now, I think Earl's win is the second greatest game in the history of the show. Strategically, Earl dominates that season from beginning to end. He's always positioned in the majority, where he holds the most agency. Yes, he works alongside the likes of Yam-Yam and Michele, but I always got the sense that Earl was the head strategic thinker of that group. Given Earl's strong positioning in the game, you would think that others would eventually catch on and target him, but Earl knew how to fly under the radar within the majority. Earl's threat level management is potentially his most impressive attribute as a player. There is just one vote cast against him the entire season, despite him being vulnerable in every tribal council. It's also worth mentioning that the only vote cast against Earl was a throwaway from Rita in the pre-merge. Earl was so dominant in the realm of threat level management that by the time his alliance took complete control at the final 6, every remaining player in the game wanted to take him to the end. Now, Earl's strategic dominance would have been meaningless without a quality social game, and I see Earl as one of the most underrated social contestants. I think Earl beats just about anyone on Fiji in a final tribal council. Some people argue that Earl would have lost to Yam-Yam in the final 3, but Yam-Yam himself admits that he loses in that combination. I'll admit that Yao probably earns a couple votes over Earl, but Earl was able to identify Yam-Yam as a potential jury threat. He never intended on rolling with Yam-Yam to the end, as he votes him out at the final 4, showcasing a cutthroat side to his game. Earl reaches the final tribal council of Fiji against Dreams and Cassandra, where he wins in a unanimous jury vote. I find it really impressive that Earl was able to both identify his ideal winning scenario and actively carve his path to that point. Had it not been for that vote from Rita in the pre-merge, Earl would have had the first perfect game in Survivor history. I really wanted to rank Earl higher on the list because this run was just so seamless from beginning to end, and it's really the lack of information on Earl that limits his ceiling amongst the all-time greats. As mentioned earlier, we've never seen Earl work from the bottom. We've never seen him overcome legitimate adversity in the game. I'd also point out that we've never seen an Earl individual immunity challenge win. So all in all, I think that Earl is a real contender to make it on the cast for Survivor 50. So if he competes on that season and performs well, ideally showcasing some other skill sets, then I could easily see myself ranking him in the top 5. As it stands now, though, I'm ranking him at his peak due to his status as a one-time player. He's here at number 9. Moving ahead to the number 8 spot, we can enter our second tier in the top 10. These next 3 contestants are all elite in 2/3 of Survivor. They are not necessarily the most well-rounded players, but their strengths in the game more than make up for it. So starting at number 8, I have the winner of Survivor Palau in Tom Westman. When I think of Tom's legacy on Survivor, my mind immediately jumps to that final immunity challenge on season 10, where he defeats Ian Rosenberger after nearly 12 hours. That immunity win encompasses Tom's biggest strength in the game, that being the physical side. I consider Tom one of the best challenge beasts to ever compete on the show. The original tribes on Palau were organized through a schoolyard pick, where Tom was thrown into the Koror tribe, whose average age was 10 years higher than the opposing Oolong tribe. Despite this obvious disadvantage, Tom led Koror to an unprecedented level of success, as they won every immunity challenge in the pre-merge. Then in the post-merge, Tom wins 5 out of 7 individual immunities. He ties the record for most individual immunity wins in a single season. I feel that Tom, in his peak physical form, is a player capable of winning out on any given season. On the social side, I look at Tom as the type of person that demands respect from a jury. His level-headed, hard-working leadership style gels with the surrounding cast. People feel empowered by Tom's leadership, and I think that he is the type of person that wins a jury vote whenever he reaches the final tribal. On Palau specifically, Tom was adored by his competitors to the point where he likely defeats any other player in a jury vote. It's important to note, though, that while Tom's leadership approach garners him respect, He's almost too prominent around camp, and people eventually catch on to his winning potential. By the Final Four of that season, Tom's closest ally in Ian had gathered the numbers against him, such that if Tom lost immunity at Final Four or Final Three, he gets voted out. I feel that a Tom Westman winning game generally requires him to win multiple immunity challenges in the end. Tom's threat level management is a major reason why I struggled ranking him higher on the list. Many of the contestants ahead of Tom had a season where they kept their allies loyal through the endgame. Finally, we get to the strategic side of the game, which I see as Tom's weakest arena. On Palau, we see Tom excel from the majority. He establishes a core 6-person alliance that runs the early merge, and he pulls off some impressive moves like the Greg vote at the final 6. It's really Tom's decisions in the late game of Palau that lead me to question his strategic ability. At Final 5, Tom knocks out his ally Karen, who was both completely loyal to him and an easy beat in the final Tribal Council. Karen was the ideal person for Tom to take far in the season, but his ally Ian convinces him otherwise. By voting out Karen, Tom destroys his own positioning, and he is on the outs for the rest of the season. While it's impressive that Tom went on to clutch out the final 2 immunity wins, I think the fact that he needed immunity to begin with shows some poor play. I would also criticize Tom's loyalty to Ian. Tom never intended on taking the shot at Ian until Ian broke their trust by admitting that he was gunning for Tom. I wonder if Tom has that killer instinct to naturally flip on his number 1 ally. Tom's strategic run on Palau presented a player that could take control but misread the optimal move. His return on Survivor Heroes vs. Villains gave me much more confidence in him as a strategist. On that season, we see Tom operate from the bottom and scrape by for a couple Tribal Councils. He pulls off the Sari blindside where he knocks her out with a successful idol play. This performance, while brief, proved that Tom could adapt to the modern strategic landscape. Now, obviously Tom's return on Season 20 was nowhere near as dominant as his first appearance. He gets voted out in the pre-merge in 16th place. However, I would argue that Tom was fighting an uphill battle on that season. Out of the 4 winners to compete on Heroes vs. Villains, I think that Tom presented the highest threat level due to his dominance on Palau. So when I look at Tom as a Survivor player, I see someone that can gather the numbers on his side, impress a jury, and dominate immunity challenges. His strategic reads from the top, as well as his excessive loyalty, draw some concern for me. He ranks here at number 8. On to number 7, I have arguably the biggest name in the history of the franchise. It's Jeff Probst's favorite player in Boston, Rob Mariano. At the time of this recording, Rob is the only Survivor player to compete on 5 US seasons, and over the course of his career, we've witnessed a wide range of outcomes from his playstyle. Rob is your prototypical strategic mob boss. In every Boston Rob season, he attempts to assemble a majority alliance where he operates as the head strategic thinker while villainizing those contestants outside his group. This approach yields varying results. On Survivor All-Stars and Survivor Redemption Island, Rob pulls off 2 of the most strategically dominant performances of all time. Meanwhile, on Survivor Marquesas, Heroes vs. Villains, and Winners at War, Rob fails to gather the numbers on his side, and his attempts to take control make him an immediate target. He gets voted out relatively early in all 3 of those seasons. So while Rob's domineering playstyle is high variance, I think he has perfected this approach over his career. In my opinion, Boston Rob deserves the title for the best strategic player when operating from the majority. If Rob holds the numbers, I have full confidence in his ability to identify the optimal move and direct the vote accordingly. We've literally seen him run the game from this position twice. On Survivor All-Stars, Rob pulls off what I consider the best losing finalist game in the history of the show. He takes control of the original Shapira tribe and he never looks back. He directs the vote in just about every tribal council that he attends on that season. En route to the end, Rob completes some high-difficulty strategic moves through his social influence. At the swap, Rob's number 1 ally in Amber gets sent over to the opposing Mogo Mogo tribe by herself. At the time, it looked like Rob was en route to losing his closest connection on the island, but he's able to leverage his pre-game alliance with Lex in order to save Amber in a tribal council that Rob himself does not even attend. It's arguably the most impressive strategic maneuver in Rob's entire Survivor career. Later at the merge, Rob shows a cutthroat side to his strategic game as he's willing to blindside Lex the round after Lex saved Amber. Then on Survivor Redemption Island, Rob perfects his mob boss playstyle 7 years after his near loss on All-Stars. Rob's win on Season 22 is in serious consideration for the title of the most dominant game of all time. There, Rob establishes the infamous Ometepe Alliance, a group of players that mindlessly followed him to their eventual dooms in the post-merge. This group operated like an old-school alliance, picking off members of the opposing Zapatera tribe for 5 straight tribal councils. By the time the numbers dwindled to only the 6 Ometepe contestants, Rob had successfully set up an alliance structure that would enable him to reach the final tribal against Natalie and Philip, 2 of the worst finalists in Survivor history. This season proved that Rob could identify his ideal winning scenario and direct the game accordingly to achieve that outcome. Many people discredit Rob's dominant win, claiming that he was a 4-time contestant competing against a group of recruited players who knew little about Survivor. While I agree that the Redemption Island cast is weaker strategically, I don't think that I can fault Rob for the quality of the competition, as that's completely outside his own control. Plus, Rob had already proven this strategy on Survivor All-Stars, a cast of veteran players. I feel like we have enough evidence to say that when Rob's strategy works, it results in a seamless game. The strategic downside with Rob is his lack of adaptability. I know that Rob can dominate from a head strategist position, but we have little evidence of him surviving on the bottom or flipping the game in his favor. On Survivor Marquesas, Rob enters the merge down in numbers 7-3. He proceeds to blow up around camp, magnify his threat level, and get voted out in 10th place. What's even worse for Rob is the fact that his allies in Sean and Vesepia flipped the game the round after Rob went home. It proved that there were cracks in the opposing Row 2 alliance, which Rob himself could not break. Then on Survivor Heroes vs. Villains, Rob is put into the minority position through circumstances outside his control. From there, Rob loses his connection with Coach, and he falls to the bottom of the Villains tribe where he gets voted out in 13th place. Then we see on Survivor Winners at War, Rob attempts and fails to take control at the tribe swap, which causes him to go out in 17th place. All of this is to say that there is a serious piece missing in Rob's strategic game. I just have a lot of confidence in Rob's ability to gather the numbers and position himself in the majority from the beginning. Moving on to the physical side of the game, where Rob is sneakily one of the best challenge competitors in the history of the franchise. He holds the record for most individual immunity challenge wins in a Survivor career with 9, which can partially be attributed to the fact that he competed on the most seasons, but it's still worth pointing out. Rob, in his physical prime, was capable of challenge beasting his way through the post-merge. On Survivor All-Stars, he pulls off one of the best physical games of all time as he wins 4 out of 7 individual immunities. This ability to win challenges at a high rate partners well with Rob's dominant strategic playstyle. If his core alliance ever recognizes Rob as a threat in the late game, he can still reach the end through immunity wins. Finally, we can hit on Rob's social game, which is widely considered his weakest arena. Rob's strategic play style inherently damages his social potential. In order to gain power, Rob will utilize fear tactics, where he threatens or intentionally combats other players in order to acquire information. For example, we see him direct his entire tribe to empty their bags at a tribal council in Winners at War. Once in power, Rob works to isolate those players on the bottom from those in the majority. In Redemption Island, Rob instructs the Ometepe Alliance to sleep in a separate shelter and eat separate food from the opposing Zapatera Alliance. He also creates the buddy system on that season, where members of his alliance cannot go off to speak with Zapatera members alone. This approach to gaining and maintaining power burns many of Rob's relationships with players who later sit on the jury. Combine these tactics with Rob's combative personality, and you get a contestant that struggles to win a jury vote. On All-Stars, Rob had 3 players on the jury in Alicia, Lex, and Big Tom who would all not vote for him in any final tribal council combination. I don't know if there was a winning scenario for Rob by the end of that season. Maybe he wins against Jenna, but that scenario boils down to the jury votes of Rupert and Cheyenne, where Rob needs both to guarantee the win. Then on Redemption Island, Rob wins handily against Natalie and Phillip, but many people forget about the Ashley Underwood factor. Ashley got voted out at Final Four of that season, and while she held little control through the post-merge, it's been reported after the show that Ashley would have defeated Rob in the end. In other words, Rob's perfectly constructed strategic season could have all fallen apart if Ashley wins the final immunity challenge. It's impressive that Rob was able to navigate to the combination where he won the jury vote, but I don't know if there were many other potential winning scenarios for him. I mentioned earlier that this tier includes 3 players, each with a hole in their respective games, and for Rob, that is the social side. At the end of the day, though, I think that Rob's elite potential in the physical and strategic departments were enough to rank him in the top 10. He's here at number 7. On to number 6, I have the highest rated non-winner on this list in Cirie Fields from Survivor Panama, Micronesia, Heroes vs. Villains, and Game Changers. When discussing non-winners of Survivor, Cirie is the consensus number 1. I don't think there's a real argument right now in favor of any other non-winner over Cirie. Part of Cirie's legendary reputation is wrapped up in her unlucky eliminations. Across 4 seasons, we have never witnessed Cirie go home in a normal tribal council. In Survivor Panama, Cirie is knocked out at the Final Four in a fire-making challenge. The only reason that challenge happens in the first place is because Terry held an overpowered immunity idol that was valid through the Final Four. Then on Survivor Micronesia, Cirie perfectly navigates to the Final 3 under the assumption that the final tribal council would occur in that round. After all, the previous 3 seasons all featured a Final 3. In fact, Micronesia was originally meant to operate with 3 finalists, but production changed it to a Final 2 due to the number of medical evacuations earlier on the season. Cirie ends up getting voted out in 3rd place, largely due to factors outside her own control. Then on Survivor Heroes vs. Villains, Cirie is eliminated by an idol play in a round where her side held the numbers advantage. Finally, you get Survivor Game Changers, where Cirie goes out at Final 6 in a spot where every other player was immune either through a challenge win or immunity idols. Cirie was literally voted out in a tribal council where 0 votes were cast against her. All of this is to say that every Cirie loss was surrounded by some unlucky circumstances. When I look at Cirie's Survivor career at large, I think she is one of the best strategists in the history of the show. I have full confidence in Cirie finding her way into the majority alliance and excelling from that position. She's literally accomplished this on every appearance. On Survivor Panama, Cirie starts on the outside of the Kasaya tribe, but she's able to recover from that position by establishing inroads with the likes of Aris and Danielle. She later plays a large role in keeping that Kasaya alliance together through the early post-merge. When that group is forced to turn on each other at Final 6, Cirie expertly positions herself in the center, where she orchestrates a 3-2-1 vote split to knock out Courtney. The main strategic knock against Cirie's Panama game is her outlook on the final tribal council. Cirie planned on rolling to the end with Aris, where I think she more than likely loses the season. On Survivor Micronesia, Cirie pulls off arguably the greatest non-winning strategic game in the history of the show. On that season, she operates as the head strategic thinker of the Black Widow Brigade. While I credit Parvati for assembling that group, I think that Cirie was more instrumental to orchestrating many of their decisions in the post-merge. At Final 5, she orchestrates the Eric Reichenbach blindside, where her side convinces Eric to give up individual immunity. She also positions herself at the core of the Black Widow Brigade, which enables her to reach the Final 3 with Parvati and Amanda. The only downside for Cirie on this season is her loyalty to that duo. Cirie knew that Amanda and Parvati were an inseparable pair, yet she continued to work with them late into the season. As a result, there are spots like the Final 4 where if Natalie won immunity, Parvati and Amanda would have stuck together to vote out Cirie. On Survivor Heroes vs. Villains, Cirie positions herself in the majority on the original Heroes tribe, where she held legitimate agency. She goes out at Final 17 through a Tom Westman idol play. Cirie's run on Survivor Game Changers is probably her weakest performance from a strategic perspective. Throughout the pre-merge, Cirie operates outside the majority. She gets very lucky in that her various tribes win every possible immunity challenge. If some challenges break a different way, Cirie potentially goes out in the pre-merge, but I don't fault her too much for that hypothetical, given her reputation as compared to the rest of the Game Changers cast. In the post-merge, Cirie loses control at multiple points, like the Aussie blindside at Final 12, and especially the Michele vote at Final 7. Advantage Geddon takes out Cirie at the Final 6, but I don't know if there was a winning avenue for her. Even if Cirie was successful in taking out Sarah in that round, I don't see her allies in Ty and Aubry as players willing to take her to the end. So let's move on to the social side of the game. Cirie has an argument for the best social player in Survivor history. Across her 4 seasons, Cirie has proven herself as a player capable of developing meaningful bonds on the island, which results in social insulation. On Panama, she locks down a #1 ally in Aris, who intended on taking her to the Final 2. On Micronesia, her relationship with Amanda and Parvati inspires them to ride with her to the Final 3 over Natalie, in spite of Natalie's relatively lower winning stock. While we have never seen Cirie perform in a Final Tribal Council, I fully believe that she is a contestant capable of winning a jury vote more often than not. Straight up, if the Micronesia Final Tribal Council format was a Final 3 as Cirie intended, then I think she wins the season. It's a close race, but according to postseason interviews, Cirie wins over Parvati and Amanda in a 3-2-2 jury vote, where Cirie picks up the votes of Alexis, Eric, and Eliza. I also think that Cirie would have won a jury vote on Game Changers, but the path to the end there was a bit narrower. Finally, we can acknowledge the biggest weakness on Cirie's Survivor resume, that being the physical side. Cirie has never won an individual immunity challenge. She completely lacks that ability to bulldoze her way to the end, which limits her avenues to the Final Tribal. I think that you could partially attribute Cirie's deep runs, especially on Game Changers, to the fact that her opponents recognized her as a threat that would be vulnerable at every opportunity. In other words, why vote out Cirie in the early merge if you know that you can take the shot later in the season? Cirie's struggles and challenges also means that she is constantly at risk of going home in the pre-merge if her tribe starts on a losing streak. In fact, Cirie receives votes in her first tribal council on Panama due to her poor challenge performance. All in all, it's an absolute tragedy that Cirie Fields has not won a season of Survivor. Looking forward, I doubt that we will ever see Cirie win a season due to her legendary reputation within the franchise. Hopefully she proves me wrong in the future, but for now, I will rank her here at number 6. Entering the top 5, all contestants from this point forward excel in every core aspect of the game. The number 5 selection also marks the start of my 3rd tier within the top 10. The next 2 players on this list are defined by their well-rounded nature, but they lack either consistency or an all-time winning game on their resumes. So starting with the number 5 spot, I have Jeremy Collins from Survivor San Juan del Sur, Survivor Second Chance, and Survivor Winners at War. Jeremy is another example of a player that honed his skill set over the course of his Survivor career. In his first appearance on Season 29, Jeremy comes across as your stereotypical challenge beast. He takes control of the original Hanapu tribe in the pre-merge, but by the merge, other contestants are already eyeing him up as a threat. In fact, Jeremy was the consensus target at both the Final 12 and the Final 11 of that season. He only survives those rounds due to a Julie quit and an individual immunity win. The second that Jeremy is vulnerable in the post-merge, the other players band together to vote him out in 10th place. Jeremy's return on Survivor Second Chance revealed a more polished social and strategic player, one that understood the importance of keeping other dominant figures in the game as a way to mitigate his own threat level. Jeremy's performance on Second Chance is the driving factor behind his high ranking. On that season, Jeremy implements the meat shield strategy, where he maintains the likes of Savage and Joe through the mid-merge. By pushing other threats ahead of himself, Jeremy opens up time to form inroads with the other contestants who later elect to ride with him to the final tribal council. I feel that people don't talk about this enough, but Jeremy's social game on Second Chance was top-notch. In the early merge, he's tightly aligned with Stephen Fishbach, and when Fishbach goes out at Final 9, Jeremy pivots to a new alliance with the likes of Spencer, Tasha, and Kimmy. I think that Jeremy is the type of contestant who can find his group and maneuver accordingly when the dynamics change. On the topic of Jeremy's social game, I'd also credit him for his jury management. On Second Chance, Jeremy recognized the family-oriented nature of the jury, and he caters his final speech accordingly. He wins the season in a unanimous jury vote, which really speaks to Jeremy's ability to connect with other players on the island. I think the primary argument in favor of Jeremy over the player ranked at number 4 is that I have more confidence in Jeremy just outright winning a jury vote. I really don't see a world where Jeremy sits at the end without legitimate win equity. Jeremy's run on Second Chance also showcased a high level of strategic ability. Jeremy knows how to navigate into a majority alliance. Outside the Steven blind side, Jeremy operates as a pivotal figure within the dominant power structure in every post-merge tribal council. En route to the end, Jeremy proves that he can incorporate advantages into his game as he knocks out Sierra at Final 10 and Kimmy at Final 6 through idle plays. Even more important, Jeremy is a player capable of identifying his winning final tribal council combinations. He expertly positions himself with Tasha and Spencer in the end of Cambodia, where he wins in a landslide. Now, some people may discredit Jeremy's endgame by claiming that Wentworth would have defeated him in a jury vote. I agree that Wentworth would have narrowly beaten Jeremy in that scenario, but I think that it's important to acknowledge that Jeremy never intended on taking Wentworth that far in the season. Jeremy set up the pieces on the board to take out Wentworth at Final 6 and Final 5, but she survives those rounds through an idle play and an immunity challenge win. I think the real strategic knock against Jeremy on Second Chance is his overall reliance on Spencer, especially at the Final 6. In that round, Jeremy failed to acknowledge that Kimmy was plotting to flip against his group, and if not for Spencer's read on the situation, Jeremy goes out in 6th place. Last component of Jeremy's winning game that we need to discuss is the physical side. It's obvious just looking at Jeremy that he's a high-quality challenge performer. He's a player that's always capable of winning out to reach the final tribal council, which we see on Cambodia where he wins the final immunity challenge. Jeremy's third appearance on Survivor Winners at War showed a different side to his game, one where he's positioned on the bottom and scraping by every round. Jeremy's attempts to preserve his meat shields actually fail in Season 40, and by the Final 10, he's positioned as the biggest target on the board. For me, it's a negative for Jeremy in that he becomes the biggest threat in the early merge. I worry that if Jeremy played 100 seasons of Survivor, there are many where he gets voted out in that section of the game due to his well-rounded nature. I don't think that Jeremy can simply rely on his social bonds to hide in the post-merge. I think he needs other threats around him, which is partially outside his own control. With that said, I will credit Jeremy for his survival through those rounds on the bottom. At Final 10, Jeremy recognizes that the other players are gunning for him, and he correctly plays his safety without power advantage. He's then able to rebound through his connection with Tony, which carries him 2 additional rounds before getting voted out. I think that Jeremy's Winners at War game showcased his strategic flexibility in operating from the bottom. I just look at Jeremy as one of the most well-rounded contestants to ever compete on the show. While he may struggle surviving the early merge on any random season, I think that if you give Jeremy some time to establish his roots, he can always navigate to the final tribal where he knows how to shine in front of a jury. He's ranked here at number 5. On to number 4, I have a contestant who has 2 all-time games on her resume, one of which resulted in a win. It's Sarah Lacina from Survivor Cagayan, Game Changers, and Winners at War. Sarah's win on Game Changers cemented her as a legendary Survivor player. After that win, I would have placed Sarah somewhere in the 13 to 15 range. But then she comes back on Winners at War, where she plays easily the second best game on the island. That run moves Sarah into my top 5, as she falls just one fire-making challenge away from reaching the final tribal council, where I think she wins the season. On the surface, I think that the strongest aspect of Sarah as a Survivor player is the social side of the game, which is interesting considering that her personality does not really pop off screen. I feel like we never see how Sarah builds these bonds across her 3 seasons, but every time, like clockwork, we reach a point in the post-merge where just about every remaining contestant wants to work with her. On Cagayan, she enters the merge as the crucial swing vote between 2 competing alliances. She's in a spot where she would have been aligned with the core of either group. Now, Sarah makes some major mistakes in that round that ultimately lead to her elimination, but the fact that she was able to position herself in the power seat is still impressive. Then on Survivor Game Changers, Sarah builds connections across the entire beach, which enables her to play this dynamic game in the post-merge, bouncing back and forth between alliances with little social backlash. She's well insulated socially for just about the entire season. She does not have a vote cast against her until the final 6, where Cirie, another legend of the franchise, finally picks up on Sarah's win equity. Then on Winners at War, Sarah does it a 3rd time. She enters that season as one of the consensus threats on the cast according to preseason interviews, yet she still builds relationships and forms this dominant power structure around her. In the early merge, she runs the majority alongside Sophie, and when Sophie goes out at Final 9, Sarah pivots to directing the game alongside Tony. While Tony deserves a lot of credit for the success of the Cops R Us alliance on that season, I think that Sarah still played a pivotal role in their dominance. Not to mention, Sarah had people in the endgame that were more loyal to her than Tony. Ben, for example, willingly throws his game at Final 5 as a way to bolster Sarah's resume. You can definitely criticize the strategy of voting out Ben in that round, but it's still crazy that Sarah was capable of convincing a previous winner to essentially fall on his sword for her. Sarah's social prowess translates not only to strategic agency in the game, but also legitimate win equity. On Game Changers, Sarah is in a spot at the Final 4 where she defeats any remaining contestant in a jury vote. There's a few members on the jury who felt burned by Sarah in the end, but for the most part, she's able to rely on her friendships to overshadow her backstabbing playstyle. She defeats Brad and Troyzan in a 7-3-0 jury vote. On Winners at War, Sarah goes out at Final 4 in firemaking, but I think if you look at the collection of players on the board at Final 6, Sarah beats any of them in a jury vote outside of Tony. I feel that Sarah's social game makes her one of the most consistent players in the history of the show, but her strategic versatility also gives me a lot of confidence in her ability to win any random season. I think we've seen Sarah take 2 completely different approaches in the post-merge. On Game Changers, she operates from the middle and showcases an ability to flip back and forth between alliances. Then on Winners at War, we watch Sarah play a more classic version of Survivor, one where she dominates through a loyal majority alliance. We've never really seen Sarah work from the bottom, but I almost see that as a positive in that she's proven to find her way into the majority every time. On the topic of Sarah's strategic game, I think she's one of the best players in terms of late game positioning. On both Game Changers and Winners at War, Sarah reaches the finale with allies that genuinely wanted to take her to the end. On Game Changers, Sarah is in a spot at Final 4 where she's taken to the final tribal council if either Brad or Troyzan win final immunity. I can even see Ty voting to keep Sarah in the game in the event that he won that last challenge. Then on Winners at War, Sarah maintained an ally in Tony who reported after the show that he intended on bringing her to the end due to their relationship. Granted, I'm almost positive that Sarah loses to Tony in a jury vote, but it's still impressive that she was able to convince him to roll with her that far in the game in spite of her high winning stock. There's 2 main strategic knocks against Sarah, one of which being her threat level management. At the merge of Cagayan, Sarah completely mismanages her threat level. She's originally positioned in the middle, but through making demands of the competing alliances, she magnifies her target and she's voted out in 11th place. Then at the final 6 of Survivor Game Changers, Sarah's threat level peaks and Cirie successfully gathers the numbers against her. If not for the legacy advantage, Sarah goes home in that round, and she never returns for season 40. You can definitely credit Sarah in that she actively deceived another player into willing her that advantage, but it's not great that she needed immunity there to begin with. The other strategic drawback with Sarah is her killer instinct. I think that the Game Changers version of Sarah was willing to flip on any ally. We see this at the final 9, where she knocks out Sierra as a way to receive her legacy advantage. That side of Sarah wasn't apparent in the Winners at War edition. On that season, she refuses to flip on Tony despite receiving multiple signs from the jury suggesting that she would lose to him in the end. Finally, we reach the physical side of Survivor, where Sarah is above average. She does not have an individual immunity win in her Survivor career, but I still look at Sarah as a quality challenge performer, someone that will always make it through the pre-merge on the basis of her physical abilities. So all in all, I know that some people are not very high on Sarah because she doesn't necessarily make the best television, but I cannot see a real argument for ranking her anywhere outside the top 5. She's a player that's elite in every core aspect of Survivor, especially the social arena. She ranks here at number 4. On to number 3, we can discuss my final tier for the top 10 that I'm calling the contenders. I believe that these are the 3 players with legitimate arguments for the title of the greatest of all time. So this particular contestant has moved around a bit in my numerous iterations of this list, ranking as high as number 2 and as low as number 5. Ultimately, I landed somewhere in the middle, but still within this contenders tier. It's the Black Widow herself in Parvati Shallow. When discussing Parvati as a Survivor player, it's important to acknowledge the length of her career on the show. Parvati enters Survivor in Season 13, Survivor Cook Islands, at the young age of 23, where she plays the role of the seductress, someone that actively flirts with the other contestants in order to achieve her ideal outcome. By her final appearance on Winners at War, Parvati is 36 years old. She's a more mature version of herself that takes an alternative strategic approach. All of this is to say that there's multiple versions of Parvati on Survivor, and each one presents a unique set of strengths and weaknesses. I'll still try my best, though, to identify those common characteristics across Parvati's 13-year Survivor career. Starting with the physical game, I think that Parvati is one of the best challenge competitors in the history of the show on the women's side. She has 4 individual immunity wins on her resume, which is the second most by any woman. She's the type of player that's always capable of bulldozing her way to the end, which we see to a degree on Heroes vs. Villains, where Parvati wins multiple crucial challenges in spots where she potentially goes home without immunity. Looking at the social side of the game, I think that this is Parvati's weakest arena. I see Parvati as a player that's incredible at forming connections within her primary alliance, but she has a tendency to isolate those players outside her main group. In Survivor Cook Islands, Parvati positions herself at the center of the Railroad tribe. There, she maintains multiple alliances with the likes of Candace, Adam, and Nate, who all wanted to ride with her to the end. Outside Railroad, though, Parvati is perceived as this flirtatious threat, and she's eventually voted out in 6th place when Yule picks up on her true potential within the game. Then on Survivor Micronesia, Parvati builds a stable all-women's alliance called the Black Widow Brigade that runs the post-merge. Parvati operates as the best socially insulated player within that group. She reaches the final 3 of that season with Cirie and Amanda, both of whom intended on taking her to the end. The issue there is Parvati's treatment of competitors outside the Black Widow Brigade. She burns people like Ozzy, who later rip her apart on the jury. Then we get to Survivor Heroes vs. Villains, which I think best exemplifies Parvati's social tendencies. There again, she forms loyal alliances within the Villains tribe with the likes of Russell and Danielle. However, Parvati's relationships with the heroes on that cast were just non-existent. After gaining control in the post-merge, Parvati blatantly mocks those players on the bottom by reading JT's letter aloud. Obviously, Parvati's association with Russell damaged her social game as well, but I think that some of the social backlash was self-inflicted. As a result, Parvati loses the season to Sandra despite flashing a superior strategic resume. Parvati does not receive a single winning jury vote from a member of the Heroes Alliance. All of this is to say that I have a lot of confidence in Parvati's ability to form a stable majority around herself, but I worry about her relationships with players outside that alliance. Similar to Boston Rob, but to a lesser extent, I think that Parvati is the type of contestant that would reach the end frequently over 100 seasons, but there are many scenarios where she loses a jury vote due to her social deficits. Then we reach the strategic side of Survivor, where I look at Parvati as an elite strategist. I feel that when discussing Parvati's strategic ability, it's important to acknowledge the fact that she has 2 seasons that are drastically impacted by factors outside her own control. On Survivor Cook Islands, Parvati's route to the final tribal council is essentially screwed over by production-infused twists. If not for the bottle twist on that season, Parvati's side enters the merge with the numbers advantage 6-4, and if that Raro group takes control of the game, Parvati would have been in an amazing spot moving forward at the core of the dominant alliance. Instead, the bottle twist opens the door for the opposing I2 alliance, and it ultimately results in Parvati's side falling apart and Parvati going out in 6th place. So we have one clear example of production destroying Parvati's long-term strategic outlook. Survivor Micronesia is the opposite story, where Parvati's game is saved by production interference. That season's Final Tribal Council format changes from a Final 3 to a Final 2 due to a series of medical evacuations. Parvati reaches the Final 3 with Amanda and Suri, where I think she loses the game to Suri had the Final Tribal operated the way that she intended. So I can understand ranking Parvati either higher or lower on this list due to those outside the game factors that impact 2 of her appearances. Diving deeper into Parvati's strategic game, I've always been impressed by her ability to overcome others' perceptions. I feel that Parvati has faced higher hurdles than just about any other player in the top 10 due to her iconic reputation within the franchise. Following Cook Islands, Parvati never entered a season of Survivor with anything close to a clean slate. On Survivor Micronesia, Parvati is selected for the Favorites tribe, where she faces Jonathan Penner, a player that immediately targeted her based on their relationship in Cook Islands. Parvati overcomes that rough start. She successfully dodges Penner's attacks, and her side takes control of the Favorites tribe. She later goes on to win the season. Then on Survivor Heroes vs. Villains, Parvati comes forward as an early target again due to her popular run on Micronesia. There again, Parvati adapts and aligns with an aggressive strategic player in Russell who was willing to save her with an idol play in the pre-merge. She jumps that initial hurdle and places 2nd on the season. Survivor Winners at War is a similar story where Parvati is arguably the biggest name on the entire cast. Her reputation combined with an unlucky tribe swap are largely responsible for her pre-merge elimination. I would also like to credit Parvati for her ability to incorporate idols and advantages into her game. Keep in mind that Parvati entered Survivor at a relatively early point, just 2 seasons after the introduction of the immunity idol. Her playstyle grows over time with the development of the show itself. On Micronesia, she helps Amanda find an idol that saves her at the final 6. Then on Heroes vs. Villains, she has the famous double idol play at the merge, which gives the villains control of the game. I'll admit that I'm a bit lower on that move. I think the ideal outcome for Parvati there is that she just uses one idol correctly, but it's an impressive play nonetheless. Last strategic note with Parvati is her outlook on the endgame, where results are mixed. I think that Parvati's proven to have a solid read on the jury. On Micronesia, she rolls to the final 3 with Suri, where I think she would have lost, but it's at least a close vote. Beyond that round, with the introduction of the final 2, Parvati correctly identified that she had a better chance at beating Amanda in the end over Suri. On Heroes vs. Villains, Parvati obviously loses to Sandra in the end, but it's worth noting that Parvati was literally the one player at Final 4 campaigning to take out Sandra. She's unable to accomplish this goal because Russell won individual immunity, so he had ultimate say on the vote. So that's an interesting case where Parvati had the correct read, but but lacked the agency to make that vote happen. So looking at Parvati's Survivor career at large, it's a very impressive resume. She has a legendary reputation within the franchise, and in my opinion, it's completely deserved. I placed her in this final tier primarily due to her longevity. You will struggle to find many other Survivor contestants with deep runs on 3 seasons. I couldn't rank Parvati at the number 2 or the number 1 spot because I generally favor peak over longevity. I don't think that Parvati's best season of Survivor is as impressive as the 2 contestants ahead of her. I can totally understand that someone who values consistency more in these rankings could place Parvati at number 1. For me though, she's here at number 3. At number 2, I have a contestant who has, in my opinion, the highest peak in Survivor history. It's Kim Spradlin from Survivor One World and Survivor Winners at War. I look at Kim's game on Season 24 as the most dominant win of all time. That run alone launches her into the contenders tier of my rankings. On that season, Kim shines in all 3 aspects of the game, but especially the social side. At some point down the line, I want to make a ranking of the best social contestants in Survivor history, but here's a spoiler. Kim is number 1. I think Kim is an absolute master at building loyal alliances, which offers her numerous strategic options and potential pathways to the end. On One World, we watch Kim form connections throughout the entire pre-merge, such that by the merge, she's positioned as the head strategic figure of both competing alliances. Kim had successfully placed the pieces on the board in a way that guaranteed her safety and control no matter which alliance won that initial battle. Throughout the post-merge of that season, Kim's connections provide a level of social insulation rarely seen on Survivor. Kim perfects threat level management as just about every contestant on the beach genuinely considered her their number 1 ally. The only player on the One World cast who caught on to the power of Kim's social bonds was Troyzan, who held an immunity idol. That idol presented a major threat to Kim's long-term trajectory, but at the end of the day, her relationships prevailed as the other castaways leaked that intel back to Kim herself. This enables Kim to evade Troyzan's attempted betrayal at the final 9, then knock out Troyzan at final 8, effectively removing the only opposing force on the season. From that point forward, Kim seamlessly navigates through the rest of the game. The post-merge of One World is widely considered one of the most boring stretches in Survivor history due to the lack of parity. Kim's social stranglehold on the season literally hits a point where it damages the entertainment product itself. By the time she reaches the final 5, she's positioned in the middle of 2 pairs where both groups want to roll with her to the end, and she wins in either combination. My opinion of Kim's social game is further elevated when you consider her strategic agency in the post-merge. Kim operates as the head of the majority all season. Most other contestants who take on that role, like a Boston Rob, often burn social bridges in the process, and as a result, they generally struggle to win a jury vote. Kim is the exception to this rule. The jury of One World adored her to the point where I think she defeats literally any other post-merge contestant in a final tribal council. So I think that most people would agree that Kim's run on One World is the best social game of all time. But it's also in the conversation for one of the greatest physical games in the history of the show. Kim's 4 individual immunity challenge wins ties the women's single-season record. At her core, Kim is a challenge beast. In the rare instance that Kim fails to connect with her surrounding cast socially, she can always bulldoze her way through the game via challenge wins. Strategically, Kim proves on One World that she can excel from a position of power as she directs the vote every step of the way. En route to the final tribal council, Kim pulls off some wild strategic moves that many other elite players would never even bother attempting. At Final 10, Kim learns about Troyzan's idol from Jay, and she has the killer instinct to flip the vote onto Jay in that same round. Then at Final 6, she convinces Alicia to flip against Tarzan, who had 0 chance at winning a jury vote. Kim completes all of these high-difficulty moves while holding an immunity idol, which she never even needed to achieve her ideal outcome. For me, the only strategic knock against Kim is her decision to roll with Sabrina and Chelsea to the final 3. I think that the alternative final 3 deal available with Alicia and Christina is a more comfortable win, but Kim wins in either scenario. In my mind, Kim's win on One World automatically solidified her as a legend of Survivor. However, Kim has her own group of haters who claim that her success on season 24 derives more so from the ineptitude of the surrounding cast rather than the excellence of Kim herself. On the surface, I agree that the cast of One World is simply weaker from a strategic perspective, but I feel that the incompetence of those players is often blown out of proportion. Out of the 18 contestants on One World, 9 applied for a spot on Survivor, meaning they had at least a foundational understanding of the game beforehand. Further, 2 contestants on One World, in Monica and Troyzan, went on to reach the final tribal council in their second appearances. I'm not saying that the One World cast was this elite group of strategic masterminds, but I think it's on par with the other casts from that era of the show. In researching Kim's game for this podcast, I stumbled across a video by the YouTube channel Blindsided, where the creator proposed an interesting question that I wanted to bring up here. For all of Kim's doubters, which scenario is more likely? Option A, Kim was a dominant all-time contestant that made her competition appear inept by comparison. Or option B, production completely dropped the ball and casted 17 babies surrounding an average Survivor player. I think that option A is far more believable, so I don't discredit Kim's One World game on the basis of the surrounding cast. So I've spent all this time hyping up Kim's win on season 24, but we need to acknowledge her second appearance on Survivor Winners at War. I know that a lot of people look back on Kim's run on season 40 unfavorably, but that performance actually improved my opinion of her. Prior to that season, we knew that Kim could dominate the game from the majority, but we'd never seen her operate from the bottom. Winners at War filled in those gaps. She starts the season on the outskirts of the Dakal tribe, but by the tribe swap, Kim has recovered and established her roots. The Queenslayer Tribal Council is a particularly impressive look for Kim, as she resists the urge to play her idol in a spot where just 3 total contestants were vulnerable. Kim knew that she had built the necessary bonds to hold on to that idol, and she survives with 0 votes cast against her. I feel like that tribal council will go down in Survivor history as a masterclass by Denise, but I think that Kim deserves a lot of credit there for her patience and awareness. Later on in the post-merge, Kim is one of the few contestants that correctly clocks Tony's control in the game. She's unable to gather the numbers against him, but the read itself is a positive on Kim's resume. So I think Kim deserves her spot here in the contenders tier, and if you are someone who values peak performance above all else, I can understand ranking Kim as the greatest player in the history of the franchise. Further, I think there is an argument for Kim as the most well-rounded contestant of all time. I believe that the gap between Kim and the number 1 player is not as large as people may assume, and I genuinely considered placing her at the top of the list. In fact, before Winners at War, I would have ranked her number 1. As it stands now, though, she's here at number 2. We've made it to the top of the list, the number 1 spot. When you look at the history of any competition, there is a period of time where there's disagreement on the title of the GOAT, but eventually one individual enters the conversation and reaches a skill level never seen before or after. In football, it was Tom Brady. In hockey, it was Wayne Gretzky. In basketball, it was Michael Jordan. And in Survivor, it's Tony Vlachos from Survivor Cagayan, Game Changers, and Winners at War. With Tony, I think it's important to start by talking about his status as a 2-time winner. I've said this throughout the podcast that player placement does not equate to player quality. So I want to be clear out of the gate, I am not ranking Tony number 1 because he won the game twice or because he won the all-winner season. After all, I put Sandra at 23 despite her winning back-to-back seasons of Survivor. I'm putting Tony at the top of my list based on his routes to victory and the characteristics shown along the way. Remember, Tony was literally one fire-making challenge away from losing season 40. And in a hypothetical world where he loses that competition and goes out in 4th place, I still would have ranked him number 1 overall based on the skills showcased throughout that season. All of this is to say that I know it's easy to hyperfixate on the final destination with these Survivor players, and while I agree that player placement is a component in these assessments, ranking solely based on that factor is just reductive. So let's jump into the career of Tony Vlachos, where on the surface, I think that Tony has two of the most impressive winning games in the history of the show, performances where he shows an insane amount of gainability in all three arenas of Survivor. We can start with the simplest component of Tony's resume, the physical game. Show a photo of Tony to anyone who's never seen Survivor, and you will immediately hear the Vin Diesel comparisons. Tony is in great physical shape. He's a player that can win his way out to the final tribal council on any given season. In Survivor Cagayan, Tony does not win an individual immunity challenge, but his various tribes win 5 out of 6 immunities in the pre-merge. Then in Survivor Winners at War, Tony proves this side of his game by winning 4 individual immunities against some elite physical competitors, including Jeremy, Natalie, and Kim. Moving on to the strategic side of the game, where straight up, I consider Tony the best strategic player of all time. Across his 2 winning seasons, we see Tony dominate the game through 2 completely different strategic avenues. On Survivor Cagayan, Tony revolutionizes Survivor by popularizing a more dynamic play style, one where he bounces back and forth between alliances. Take a look back at the Survivor winners who came immediately before Tony, and you will find that the majority of them followed a similar strategic blueprint. They functioned within a large stable alliance and positioned themselves well in the core of that group. In Survivor's 20s, you had players like Tyson, Cochran, Kim, Sophie, and Rob all win the show through variations of that strategy. En route to victory in season 28, Tony never sits back within a stable majority. He constantly flips between groups almost every round from the final 9 onwards. Going into season 40, I expected Tony to attempt the same dynamic, backstabbing playstyle, but he actually does the opposite. He proves that he can succeed through a more traditional pathway, one where he forms a stable majority that runs the back half of the game. Outside the Sophie blind side, Tony sticks by his primary alliance in the post-merge as he works alongside the likes of Sarah, Ben, and Denise. On the topic of Tony's strategic game, I look at Tony as an absolute master in reading the intentions of his competitors. In Survivor Cagayan, he intimidates Spencer into misplaying an idol at the final 8. Later on, at the final 3, Tony famously tricks Wu into taking him to the final tribal council over Cass, who was despised by the jury. A lot of people poke fun at this decision by Wu, calling it one of the worst moves in Survivor history. While I agree it's in the top tier of poor decisions, I also think that this outlook kinda undermines the efforts of Tony in that round. Tony knew that Wu was an emotional contestant that valued his integrity over all else, and Tony delivered the perfect argument that catered to Wu's individual interests. Then on Survivor Winners at War, we see Tony's reads of other players as he clocks Sophie as a contestant plotting against him. Tony decides to make the first move, and he responds with potentially the most impressive strategic maneuver in Survivor history, where he takes Sophie out of the game in a plurality vote. This ability to anticipate his opponent's upcoming moves separates Tony from 99% of the field. His Survivor brain never stops working, and it materializes in some innovative strategic ideas that we had never seen on the show before. He creates the Spy Shack and the Spy Nest to acquire information from other contestants. He expertly lies about the expiration date of his immunity idol in order to carve his path to the final 3. The last major strategic factor to discuss with Tony is his ability to overcome adversity within the game. While we've never really seen Tony operate from the bottom, there are multiple points in his Survivor career where Tony is thrown into difficult circumstances through factors outside his own control, yet he still comes out on top. In Survivor Cagayan, you had the reintroduction of the Final 2 format for the Final Tribal Council. Tony reaches the Final 3 of that season alongside Wu and Cass, where he easily would have won a jury vote. When production pushes the Final Tribal back one round, he finds a new route to the end through his alliance with Wu. Then at the final 9 of Winners at War, you had the extortion disadvantage played against Tony, which would have forced him to sit out of the immunity challenge and not vote at the upcoming tribal council. Once again, Tony adapts, and he acquires the necessary number of fire tokens in order to bypass the disadvantage. He receives a total of 6 tokens from 3 different allies solely based on their relationships. This is a perfect example of Tony's social game empowering his strategic dominance. Then at the final 6 of Winners at War, you had Natalie returning to the game from Edge of Extinction with an idol. She immediately paints a target on Tony's back, and we need to keep in mind that Natalie had just spent the last 30 plus days of the game with those contestants sitting on the jury. Natalie had a lot of credibility in calling out Tony, yet he still found a way to the end. Tony has proven himself as a player that can overcome the most difficult positions, which gives me a lot of confidence in his chances of winning any random season. The last side of Tony to hit on is his social game. I feel that this is the part of Tony that has grown the most over the course of his Survivor career. In Cagayan, Tony's mouth often got in his own way. He yells at the other castaways after receiving votes at a tribal council. After winning an immunity challenge in the pre-merge, he publicly calls his swap tribe the future top 5 of the season. Despite all of these mistakes, Tony's social blunders never actually cost him jury votes. People still respect Tony on a personal level. When he sits in the final tribal council against Wu, there was a part of me that worried that Wu would come across as the Natalie White of the season, the strategically passive player who wins anyway on the basis of his social game. The fact that Tony won Cagayan proves that his social game was strong enough to withstand his aggressive strategic playstyle. The Winners at War version of Tony was even better in the social arena. On that season, Tony beats anyone from the post-merge in a jury vote. Tony's social prowess was further evidenced by the wide range of alliances he maintained on the island. By the time Tony reaches the final 7, he has agreements with every other player in the game except Michele. With all of this said, there are people who question Tony's title as the greatest player of Survivor. I want to take some time here to rebuttal some of those common arguments utilized against Tony. The first one that I often hear is that Tony's approach to the game required a socially stable ally who balances his chaotic energy. In Cagayan, it was Trish who constantly rebuilt those relationships that Tony burnt in the post-merge, while in Winners at War, it was Sarah Lacino fulfilling a similar role. I think that this argument overstates the importance of those allies in Tony's success. Across both of those seasons, Tony orchestrates a vote that excludes his number 1 ally, yet he's able to rebuild trust with them. In Cagayan, Tony pulls off the LJ blindside without Trish, and in Winners at War, he knocks out Sophie without telling Sarah. I would also say that finding an ally who balances your personal weaknesses is not really a negative for me. Every Survivor contestant depends on other people to a degree. That's just the nature of an alliance. The second main argument that I hear against Tony revolves around his second appearance on Season 34 Survivor Game Changers. On that season, Tony magnifies his threat level immediately by running into the jungle in search of an idol. He gets voted out on Day 6 in 19th place. While Tony's Game Changers run is worth noting, I really don't believe that he had a fair shot at winning that season, given the composition of the cast. Don't let the season's title of Game Changers fool you. Outside a handful of contestants, this was a group of players with mediocre legacies, and Tony stood out as potentially the biggest threat on the board. I don't think that Tony had a chance of even sniffing the merge of Game Changers based on the people he was up against. So when I look at Tony's career at large, I think he deserves the title of the best contestant in Survivor history, regardless of your outlook in these rankings. If you value placements more than me, he's got the 2 wins on his resume. If you care more about individual characteristics, Tony checks off that box as well. I walked into this entire project with an open mind for the number 1 spot, but sometimes the consensus opinion remains the consensus for a reason. Tony is the greatest Survivor player of all time. Well, there it is, my final list of the top 50 players in the history of Survivor. If you've kept up with this series over the last month, thank you so much for your support. Survivor 50 is around a year and a half away, so I expect my placements on this list to change with that season. So stay tuned into Survivor Analytics as we continue to cover around 3 seasons of the show per year. I also release a corresponding player ranking for each of those seasons, and I hope to develop some other Survivor-related rankings for this page as well.